Picture the Jade Gate of the Han Dynasty, where a solitary messenger on horseback disappears into the western wastes in 138 BC, carrying orders he may never fulfill and knowledge he's got no way of knowing will reshape the world. The dust settles slowly behind him. The guards stationed at the gate watch until he's nothing more than a shimmer in the afternoon heat. Then they return to their watch posts, adjusting the weight of their armor against the relentless sun. They've seen others ride out before. Most don't return. But this man isn't like the others. His name's Zhang Qian, and he's carrying a message from Emperor Wu himself. A diplomatic mission, they'd call it. A desperate gamble, if we're being honest. The emperor needs allies against the Xiongnu, those nomadic cavalry warriors who've been terrorizing the northern borders for generations. Their horses are faster, their tactics are sharper, and the Han armies, for all their discipline and numbers, keep losing. So the emperor sends Zhang Qian west, into territories that exist only as rumors and travelers' tales. Find the Yuezhi people, the orders say. They hate the Xiongnu too. Forge an alliance, bring back hope, and nobody mentions what happens if the Xiongnu catch him first. Emperor Wu sits in his study that evening, long after the court officials have dispersed to their quarters. The lacquered screens around him glow amber in the candlelight. Maps spread across his desk, rendered on silk so fine you can almost see through it. These maps are works of art, but they're also confessions of ignorance. The western edges dissolve into blank space, decorated with speculative mountains and rivers that might not exist. He's a complicated man, this emperor. History remembers him for military campaigns and territorial expansion, but he writes poetry in the margins of military reports. He collects ancient texts and sponsors scholars. He understands that power isn't just about swords and soldiers. It's about knowing what lies beyond your borders. It's about horses that can outrun your enemies. It's about turning geography itself into an advantage. The Xiongnu have those horses. Their cavalry sweeps across the northern steppes like wind across grass, striking where the Han armies are weakest, vanishing before reinforcements arrives. Wu's tried everything. Fortifications, counterattacks, diplomatic marriages. Nothing works because nothing changes the fundamental equation. Their horses are better than his, so he's sent Zhang Qian to find the answer in kingdoms that might not even exist. The journey begins with optimism. Zhang Qian travels with a small entourage, maybe 100 people in total, interpreters who speak fragments of foreign languages, guards who've never seen combat beyond training drills, pack animals loaded with gifts for potential allies. They move through familiar territory at first, past guard posts and garrison towns where Han authority still means something. Then they cross into the borderlands. The landscape shifts. The roads become suggestions rather than certainties. Villages appear less frequently, then stop appearing at all. The air tastes different here, drier, sharper, carrying scents that have no name in Chinese. At night, the stars arrange themselves in unfamiliar patterns. Zhang Qian's interpreters start arguing about which direction leads where. Nobody really knows. They're 3 months into the journey when the Xiongnu find them. It happens at dawn. The attack comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Horsemen emerging from gullies and dry riverbeds where they've been waiting in silence. Zhang Qian's guards try to form a defensive position, but it's over before it really begins. The Xiongnu aren't interested in killing them. They want prisoners, leverage, information about what the Han Emperor's planning. Zhang Qian becomes a captive, 13 years. Let that number settle in your mind. 13 years of captivity, living among the very people he was sent to oppose. The Xiongnu don't throw him in a dungeon or chain him to a post. That's not how nomadic peoples handle prisoners. Instead, they absorb him into their community. He's given a wife, a Xiongnu woman, who teaches him their language. He has a son. He learns to ride in the Xiongnu style, learns to shoot from horseback, learns the rhythms of a life built around following herds across endless grasslands. He never stops being a prisoner, but the edges of his captivity blur. Years pass. His son learns to walk, then to ride. His wife tells him stories about her childhood, about the spirits that live in mountains and rivers. He forgets what some Chinese words sound like. The memory of Emperor Wu's court becomes dreamlike, too bright and formal to feel entirely real. But he doesn't forget the mission. 13 years? And then one night he simply leaves, takes his wife and son, a few horses, whatever supplies they can carry without raising suspicion, rides west again, picking up the thread of his original journey as if more than a decade hasn't passed. The Xiongnu search for him, of course. But the steppes are vast, and Zhang Qian's learned their tactics. He knows how to hide, how to move without leaving obvious trails, how to read the landscape for water and shelter. He reaches the territories he was originally seeking. The Yuezhi people have moved, scattered by the same Xiongnu pressure that motivated his mission. But there are other kingdoms here, entire civilizations that the Han courts never heard of. Bactria, with its Greek-influenced architecture and bilingual coins. Parthian merchants who speak of Rome as if it's a real place, not a myth. Cities built around oases, where water's currency and caravans are economic lifelines. Zhang Qian walks through marketplaces where nobody speaks Chinese. He sees glass manufactured with techniques unknown in the Han Empire. He watches metal workers creating bronze alloys that'd fascinate the emperor's craftsmen. He hears rumors of kingdoms even farther west, places with names like Antioch and Alexandria, where the Mediterranean laps against shores he can't imagine. This is the accidental discovery. He came looking for military allies and found something far more valuable, proof that the world's larger than anyone in the Han court imagined. These Western kingdoms have goods that Chinese nobles would pay fortunes to own. They have horses bred specifically for warfare, with bloodlines carefully maintained over generations. They have access to precious stones and metals that exist only as myths in Chinese literature. And they've never heard of silk. Zhang Qian spends months in these Western territories, collecting information the way some people collect coins. He learns trading routes and seasonal patterns. He discovers which cities control which mountain passes, which kingdoms are allies and which are enemies. He understands that geography itself's the real power here. Those oasis cities aren't just convenient rest stops. They're choke points, natural monopolies. Any merchant traveling east or west has to pass through them, has to pay their fees, has to play by their rules. The extreme landscape creates extreme economics. Water isn't everywhere, so the places that have it become wealthy beyond reason. Mountain passes force travelers into predictable paths, so the kingdoms controlling those passes can tax every transaction. The Taklamakan Desert to the south, so hostile that caravans will pay almost anything to avoid crossing it. The Tian Shan Mountains to the north create natural barriers that funnel trade through specific valleys and gaps. Zhang Qian sees all of this with fresh eyes, and he understands what it means. If the Han Dynasty can establish relationships with these kingdoms, if Chinese merchants can navigate these routes, then silk and jade and all the other luxury goods piling up in imperial warehouses could find markets beyond anything the empire's ever experienced. But he also sees the dangers. The distances are staggering. The logistics? Nightmarish. Bandits control huge swaths of territory. Political alliances shift like sand in wind. Any merchant attempting this journey'd need to plan for months of travel, arrange protection through multiple kingdoms, navigate languages and customs they've never encountered. It'd take a special kind of determination, or desperation, or greed, usually all three. Zhang Qian eventually turns back toward home. his wife and son still with him. The return journey takes years. He's recaptured by the Xiongnu again, briefly, then escapes again when political upheavals distract his captors. He crosses the same mountain passes and desert basins, but this time he knows what he's looking at. He sees trade routes where before he saw only hardship. He recognizes opportunities where before he saw only obstacles. When he finally approaches the Jade Gate again, he's been gone for 13 years total. The guards who watched him leave are probably dead or retired. The emperor's older, his military situation even more desperate. The court officials who knew Zhang Qian's name have mostly forgotten it, assuming he died somewhere in the western wastes, like so many others. But he's alive, battered, transformed, carrying knowledge that'll redraw maps and reshape economies. He's brought back samples of Western goods, stories about distant kingdoms. Most importantly, he's brought proof that a path exists. Difficult, dangerous, but possible. The emperor listens to his reports with growing excitement. This isn't just intelligence about potential military allies. This is something far more valuable, a vision of connected civilizations, of goods flowing between empires, of cultural exchange on a scale nobody's attempted. The emperor orders follow-up missions, diplomatic envoys, trade expeditions, military escorts for merchant caravans. The initial trips are small, cautious, feeling out the logistics, but they succeed often enough to encourage more attempts. Chinese silk starts appearing in Western markets. Western horses start appearing in Chinese stables. Glass and jade and precious metals begin moving along the routes Zhang Qian mapped. It's the beginning of something that won't have a name for centuries. Nobody calls it the Silk Road yet. That term won't be invented until 1877, when a German scholar named Ferdinand von Richthofen sits in his study and coins the word Seidenstraße, Silk Street, literally. The name catches on because it's evocative, romantic, easier to say than the complex network of trade routes connecting Han China with Central Asian and Mediterranean civilizations. But the name's also misleading. In these early years, silk's just one commodity among many. Horses matter more, strategically. Jade holds more cultural significance. Glass is rarer. Precious metals have more universal value. Silk becomes dominant later after Chinese producers perfect their techniques and Western demand explodes. But that's decades away. Right now, in the immediate aftermath of Zhang Qian's return, the trade's about everything except silk. The economics are fascinating. A merchant in the Han capital can buy silk relatively cheaply because production's localized and supplies steady. That same silk, transported across thousands of miles through multiple kingdoms, accumulates value at every transaction. Border taxes, protection fees, payments to local guides. By the time it reaches Parthian or Roman markets, the price is multiplied dozens of times. The profit margins are staggering, but so are the risks. Entire caravans disappear into dust storms. Bandits wait at known water sources, knowing travelers have no choice but to stop there. Political conflicts close borders without warning. The weather alone can kill you in dozens of creative ways. Freeze in mountain passes, roast in desert basins, drown in flash floods that turn dry wadis into raging torrents. But people keep trying. Because the rewards justify the risks, because fortunes are being made, because these Western kingdoms are hungry for Chinese goods, and Chinese nobles are hungry for Western luxuries. Zhang Qian himself gets sent west again, years after his first journey. He's older now, more cautious, but also more knowledgeable. This second mission's explicitly commercial, establishing formal trade relationships. He doesn't get captured this time. The routes are better known, the logistics more developed. He returns with trade agreements and diplomatic protocols that'll survive for generations. After that, he retires, lives quietly. The historical records say he became a farmer, working land near the capital, raising crops and grandchildren. It's a strange ending for someone who changed history, but maybe he'd seen enough adventure for one lifetime. Maybe after 13 years of captivity and years of dangerous travel, the simple rhythm of agricultural life felt like the luxury. The emperor gives him honors and titles, but Zhang Qian doesn't seem particularly interested in court politics. He's done his part. The path's open. Other people can worry about maintaining it, and they do. The trade routes expand and formalize. Permanent way stations get established at key oases. Military garrisons protect important passes. Translation services emerged to help merchants navigate linguistic barriers. Banking systems developed to facilitate transactions across vast distances. The infrastructure of long-distance trade gradually coalesces around the routes Zhang Qian discovered. It's not always peaceful. Wars close routes. Kingdoms rise and fall, each one demanding new negotiations. Climate shifts make some paths impassable while opening others. The flow of goods is constantly interrupted, redirected, reinvented, but it never stops entirely. The connection, once made, proves too valuable to abandon. Think about what that means. One man's desperate diplomatic mission, extended by 13 years of captivity and accident, creates economic and cultural connections that'll persist for 15 centuries. The Roman emperors wearing silk togas have Zhang Qian to thank. Though they'll never know his name, the Buddhist monks traveling east to spread their teachings are following paths he mapped. The technologies and ideas that flow along these routes, cross-pollinating civilizations, all owe something to that moment when he rode through the Jade Gate into the unknown. History's full of these accidents, missions that fail their original objectives but succeed in ways nobody anticipated. Zhang Qian was supposed to forge a military alliance against the Xiongnu. He failed at that. The Yuezhi had moved, scattered, lost interest in revenge, but his failure became something greater than any planned success could have been. He found civilizations, he mapped possibilities. He proved that the world was connected in ways the Han court never imagined. And he did it not through genius strategy or perfect execution, but through resilience, through surviving captivity, through refusing to forget his mission even when it seemed pointless, through looking at the world around him and seeing not just hardship but opportunity. The maps he carried in his mind were more valuable than any military intelligence could have been. They showed a world ready for connection, hungry for exchange, capable of supporting trade on scales that would have seemed insane just decades earlier. Those mental maps would guide emperors and merchants and monks for centuries. They'd be refined and expanded and corrected, but the basic framework came from Zhang Qian's observations during those years of accidental exploration. The Silk Road isn't really about silk. It's not even really about trade, though trade's the mechanism that makes it work. It's about the human impulse to see what's beyond the horizon, to take desperate gambles on impossible journeys, to survive when survival seems unlikely, and then to share what you've learned. Zhang Qian rode out through the Jade Gate, expecting a diplomatic mission that might take a few years. He came back, having spent 13 years as a captive, having discovered civilizations, having mapped a world. The emperor wanted allies against the Xiongnu. He got something infinitely more valuable, proof that the world was larger and stranger and more connected than anyone dared to imagine. When Zhang Qian finally returned, battered and transformed, the maps he carried in his mind would draw a line across the world that merchants would follow for 15 centuries to come. The thread that conquered empires, silk as superpower, 100 BCE, 200 CE. In Rome, around 50 CE, when the first bolt of Chinese silk arrived at the imperial court, senators wept openly, not at beauty, but at the realization that their treasury was hemorrhaging gold to buy fabric from an unknown people on the other side of the world. Picture this moment. The fabric arrives wrapped in protective linen, bound with cords that have traveled through a dozen hands across half the known world. A merchant unrolls it slowly, letting the material catch the afternoon light streaming through the palace windows. And there it is, something no Romans ever touched before. It seems to glow from within, this crimson length of cloth that moves like water, like flame, like nothing they've ever seen. One senator reaches out to touch it. His fingers encounter a smoothness so complete it's almost disturbing. The fabric has no texture at all, just this impossible softness that seems to have weight and weightlessness at the same time. Someone asks the price. The merchant names a figure that makes the room go silent, the same weight in gold, pound for cloth, and that's when they weep, because they know, every single one of them knows, they'll pay it. They'll pay anything. Their wives will demand it. Their mistresses will require it. Status in Rome's always been measured in visible things, and this silk is the most visible thing imaginable. You can't fake it, you can't copy it, and that means whoever controls it controls social power itself. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. The Romans don't even know where it comes from. They call it Serica, the land of silk, but they couldn't point to it on a map if their lives depended on it. Some think it grows on trees. Others believe it's combed from a special kind of sheep. The most educated guess it's produced by enormous spiders that weave in underground caves. They're completely, utterly wrong about all of it, and the Chinese, 15,000 miles away, are perfectly happy to keep it that way. Let's go back to where it all begins, not in Rome, but in the Wei River Valley, where mulberry groves stretch across the landscape like a pale green sea. This is roughly 100 years before the Common Era, and silk production's already ancient. The Chinese have been perfecting it for over 2,000 years by this point. They've turned it into something close to science, close to magic. The process starts with worms, not just any worms. Silkworms, which are actually caterpillars, though nobody outside China really understands this yet. These creatures are so domesticated they can't survive in the wild anymore. They're completely dependent on human care, on the endless supply of fresh mulberry leaves that workers bring them every few hours. A sericulture facility during feeding time sounds like rain on a roof. This constant soft rustling as thousands of worms devour leaves with single-minded intensity. The worms eat for about a month. During that time, a single silkworm will consume roughly 50,000 times its own birth weight in mulberry leaves. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if you had to eat 50,000 times your body weight in a month. It's an eating machine, this tiny creature, converting leaf matter into something humans have decided is more precious than almost anything else on Earth. Then comes the transformation. The worm stops eating. It lifts its head and begins to sway, searching for the perfect spot. Workers have prepared small frames of straw or wood, little compartments where each worm can work undisturbed. And then it begins to spin. The thread comes from glands in the worm's head. It's a protein liquid when it first emerges, hardening on contact with air. The worm moves its head in a figure-8 pattern, over and over, building up layers. It takes roughly 3 days to complete a cocoon. When it's done, the worm's completely enclosed in this pale beige sphere, sealed inside with about 3,000 feet of continuous silk filament. Here's where it gets brutal. If you let the worm complete its transformation into a moth, it'll break through the cocoon, severing the thread into useless short pieces. So sericulture masters don't let that happen. They heat the cocoons, sometimes with steam, sometimes in ovens, killing the pupae inside while they're still dormant. The smell's sweet and sickly, like burnt sugar mixed with something organic and wrong. You get used to it if you work in silk production. You never quite forget it. Now comes the unwinding. Workers drop the heated cocoons into hot water, softening the sericin, the protein glue holding the filament together. They use small brushes to find the thread's end. Then they pull. One cocoon's filament is too fine to work with alone, so they combine 4 or 5 threads, twisting them together as they unwind. The resulting thread's still incredibly thin, finer than a human hair, but it's strong. Stronger than anything else this delicate has any right to be. This is what the Romans are buying. This impossibly fine thread woven into fabric so light it barely exists. A Roman woman can wear an entire outfit of silk and feel like she's wearing nothing at all. In Rome's hot summers, this is revolutionary, but it's also scandalous. Conservative senators complain that you can see through silk garments. They're not entirely wrong. Light silk draped directly over skin leaves very little to the imagination. Some moralists start calling it indecent, unmanly even when men wear it. There's a whole political controversy about whether silk's weakening Roman character, but the criticism does nothing. The demand only grows. By the time we reach the 1st century CE, silks become the single most important commodity moving along the trade routes. It's not just fabric anymore, it's currency. You can pay debts with it. You can bribe officials with it. Armies are provisioned with it as part of their payment. It's lightweight, highly valuable, and universally desired. In many ways, silk becomes the first global luxury brand. The economics are staggering. A Roman pound of raw silk costs roughly 14 pounds of gold at market. Finished silk garments cost even more. Pliny the Elder, that compulsive documenter of everything Roman, calculates that Rome's spending roughly 100 million sesterces every year on silk and other Eastern goods. That's an almost incomprehensible fortune flowing out of Roman hands across mountains and deserts into Chinese coffers. The Romans aren't happy about this. They can't be. It's the world's first major trade deficit and they're on the wrong side of it. But what can they do? Stop buying silk? That's politically impossible. The Roman elite have built their entire social hierarchy around visible displays of wealth. Silk's the ultimate display. To give it up would be to surrender status. And Romans don't surrender anything without a fight. So they try to learn the secret. They send spies. They offer bribes to merchants. They question every trader who's been further east. Tell us how it's made. Tell us where it comes from. Tell us anything. The merchants smile and say nothing useful. Some spread deliberate misinformation. The tree spider story probably starts with them. Keep the Romans confused. Keep them desperate. Keep them buying. The markup on silk's enormous, and everyone along the trade chain has a vested interest in maintaining the mystery. Meanwhile, in China, silk productions become a matter of national security. The Han Dynasty emperors understand exactly what they've got. A product everyone wants that nobody else can make, that doesn't lose value over distance or time. It's the perfect export, and they're not about to let that advantage slip away through carelessness. Sericulture knowledge is restricted. You can't just visit a silk production facility if you're a foreigner. You probably can't visit one if you're Chinese and unconnected to the industry. The techniques get passed down through families, through carefully controlled apprenticeships. There are laws, specific harsh laws, about exporting silkworm eggs or live worms. The penalty's death, not imprisonment. Death. The Chinese aren't playing games about this. Think about what this means. An entire empire's structured its most important industry around secrecy. They've created a monopoly that'll last for millennia, and they've done it through information control. It's almost modern in its sophistication. The Chinese emperors understand something the Romans won't figure out for centuries. Knowledge is power, and keeping knowledge secret is how you maintain power across generations. The sericulture masters themselves are almost invisible in historical records. We don't know their names, we don't know their personal stories. They're just there in the background, tending their worms, harvesting their cocoons, maintaining the process that keeps an empire wealthy. Their silence is part of the security. The less said, the less leaked, the longer the monopoly lasts. But let's talk about what makes silk so special in the first place. Why this fabric and not another? The Romans have perfectly good wool. They've got linen from Egypt. They're not unsophisticated about textiles. So what is it about silk that justifies its astronomical price? Start with the obvious. It's beautiful. Silk has a natural luster that comes from its triangular protein structure. Light hits the fabric and refracts at different angles, creating that characteristic shimmer. It looks alive. It looks like it's generating light rather than just reflecting it. When a woman wearing silk walks across a room, every eye follows. Not because of the woman necessarily, but because the fabric itself commands attention. Then there's the texture. Silk's smooth in a way that seems almost unnatural. Your fingers glide across it. It doesn't catch or pull. It's soft without being fuzzy, smooth without being slippery. It feels expensive because it is expensive and your body knows it. But here's what really makes silk special. It's smart fabric. It regulates temperature. In hot weather, silk wicks away moisture and allows air circulation. You stay cooler. In cold weather, the fabric traps tiny pockets of air between fibers, insulating you. You stay warmer. It's comfortable in almost any climate, which makes it perfect for trade routes that cross through every possible environment. A merchant can wear silk in the desert and in the mountains and be reasonably comfortable in both. Silk's also incredibly strong. A silk thread of the same diameter as a steel wire is stronger than the steel. This means silk fabric, despite being thin and light, is durable. It doesn't tear easily. It doesn't wear out quickly. A silk garment can last for decades if properly cared for. So, while it's expensive initially, it's actually economical over time. Romans who can afford it aren't just buying luxury, they're buying quality that'll outlast them. And then there's the drape. Silk falls in a way other fabrics can't match. It follows the body's contours without clinging. It creates elegant folds and gathers. In an era when fashion's all about how fabric moves and flows, silk's the undisputed champion. A skilled Roman tailor can do things with silk that are impossible with wool or linen. The garments become works of art, so yes, it's expensive, but it's not expensive without reason. The Romans are paying for genuine technical superiority, not just marketing hype. This is important to understand. The silk trade isn't built on fooling people. It's built on delivering actual value that nothing else can match. Still, the price creates problems. By the mid-1st century, Roman moralists are genuinely worried about the empire's economic stability. That 100 million sesterces flowing eastward every year isn't coming back. It's a one-way transfer of wealth. Rome produces wine, glassware, metalwork, but the East doesn't want these goods in quantities sufficient to balance the trade. They want gold, Roman gold, melted down and shipped east by the ton. Some senators propose sumptuary laws, limit who can wear silk, restrict its use to certain occasions, make it illegal for men to wear it at all. A few of these laws actually pass. None of them work, the demand's too great, the social pressure's too intense. If your neighbor's wife is wearing silk and yours isn't, you've lost status. In Rome, losing status is intolerable. So you buy silk, even if it means going into debt, even if it means contributing to the empire's economic problems. Personal interest always trumps civic duty. The emperors themselves are part of the problem. They love silk as much as anyone. Caligula reportedly wore nothing but silk for an entire year. Elagabalus insisted on silk bedding, silk curtains, silk everything. When the emperor's setting this kind of example, how can you expect citizens to show restraint? And then there's the Parthian Empire sitting right in the middle of everything, making the whole situation worse. The Parthians control the land routes between Rome and China. They're the middlemen, and they're getting rich off it. Very, very rich. They don't want Rome and China to have direct contact. Why would they? Right now, they're marking up Chinese silk before selling it to Roman merchants, then marking up Roman gold before sending it east. They're double-dipping on every transaction. The Parthians actively work to keep Rome and China separate. They spread misinformation on both sides. They make the journey sound more dangerous than it is. They imply that direct trade's impossible, that only they have the expertise and connections to move goods safely. It's a protection racket on a continental scale, and it works beautifully for about 300 years. The Romans eventually try to bypass them. They experiment with sea routes, sending ships down the Red Sea, around Arabia, across to India. It's partially successful. You can get Indian goods this way, and sometimes Chinese silk that's been traded through Indian merchants, but it's not a direct connection. The sea routes are dangerous, monsoons sink ships regularly, pirates are everywhere. The overland route through Parthian territory remains the primary channel for silk trade, which means the Parthians remain in control. Chinese sources from this period are fascinating. They mention Rome. They call it Dakin, the Great Qin, but they're vague about its location and nature. Some Chinese scholars think Rome's on the western edge of the world, beyond which lies only ocean. Others think it's a land of strange people who have odd customs about property and governance. The confusion's mutual. Neither empire really understands the other. But they don't need to understand each other. They just need silk to flow west and gold to flow east. The system works even without comprehension. This is the genius of the Silk Road. It connects people who'll never meet, who speak incomprehensible languages, who worship different gods, who have completely different world views, and none of that matters. Commerce transcends understanding. Let's return to those sericulture workshops for a moment. Imagine working there. You're probably born into it. Silk production's often a family trade. You start as a child, feeding mulberry leaves to worms, learning to recognize when they're healthy, when they're sick, when they're ready to spin. By the time you're a teenager, you're handling cocoons, learning the delicate art of finding the threads beginning, unwinding without breaking. By adulthood, you're supervising others, maintaining the careful temperature and humidity conditions that silkworms require, managing the seasonal cycles that govern everything. It's skilled work, demanding work, and it's boring in the way that all repetitive skilled work is boring. The same tasks, day after day, season after season. You're helping maintain an empire's power, but you probably don't think about it that way. You're just trying to meet your quota, feed your family, get through another day. The grand strategic implications of your work, invisible from ground level. Same goes for the merchants carrying silk west. They're not thinking about trade deficits and economic warfare. They're thinking about bandits and tolls and whether the mountain passes will be clear when they reach them. They're calculating profits and losses, worried about their camel's health, hoping the silk won't get damaged by moisture. The grand narrative of empires competing through commerce, built on 10,000 small practical concerns. And yet those small concerns, multiplied across thousands of people and hundreds of years, create something enormous. They create the first truly global economy. Before silk, trade was regional. You might move goods across a few hundred miles, maybe 1,000 if you were ambitious. But silk creates demand that spans continents. It pulls Chinese, Central Asian, Persian, and Roman economies into a single interconnected web. When silk production drops in China, prices rise in Rome. When Roman demand increases, more Chinese farmers plant mulberry trees. What happens in one place echoes across the entire system. This is new, this is revolutionary, and most people living through it don't even realize it's happening. They're too close to it, too involved in the daily details. Only historians looking back from centuries later can see the pattern, can see that silk's doing something no commodity has done before. It's creating the first global market. The Romans keep trying to crack the secret, they never quite manage it. Some Roman merchants get closer to China, close enough to see silk production facilities from a distance. But they can't get inside, they can't see the process. The Chinese security's too good, and even if someone did manage to observe silk making, they'd still need silkworm eggs and mulberry trees and the right climate and the accumulated expertise of generations. You can't just steal sericulture. You'd have to steal an entire ecosystem. There are legends about silk smuggling, stories that show up later in Byzantine sources, monks who hide silkworm eggs in hollow staffs, merchants who bribe Chinese officials. Some of these stories might even be true, though they happen much later than where we are now. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, silk remains firmly under Chinese control. The monopoly holds, and the Chinese emperors sleep well, knowing their power's secure. They've got something everyone wants, and nobody else can make. That's the best possible position in any negotiation. They're not desperate, they're not worried. They can set prices, control supply, dictate terms. The Romans need silk more than China needs Roman gold. That asymmetry defines everything. But here's what's interesting. The Chinese don't actually use that power as ruthlessly as they could. They don't cut off supply to manipulate Rome politically. They don't weaponize silk in obvious ways. They're content to let commerce proceed naturally, to let demand drive prices up organically. It's a surprisingly restrained approach to monopoly power. Maybe they understand that being too aggressive would motivate the Romans to find alternatives, to put serious resources into breaking the monopoly. Better to keep the Romans dependent but not desperate. Better to let them think they're getting a fair deal, even as gold drains steadily eastward, so silk keeps flowing year after year, decade after decade. Caravans wind through deserts, ships brave monsoons, merchants bargain in a dozen languages, and in Rome senators wrap themselves in Chinese silk, never quite believing that this beautiful fabric comes from worm spit, never quite understanding how thoroughly this single thread has entangled their empire with forces they can't see or control. The social impact in Rome, subtle but profound. Silk creates a new kind of status hierarchy. Old Roman families with their wool and linen traditions suddenly look rustic compared to nouveau riches wearing silk. Money talks louder than lineage. This creates tension. It always does. But the tension drives even more silk purchases as traditional families scramble to maintain their social position. Women become the primary consumers. Roman men wear silk too, but the real demand comes from women who've made silk the ultimate status symbol. A woman wearing silk to a dinner party has announced her husband's success more effectively than any words could. She's walking, shimmering proof of wealth and connection and sophistication. Other women notice, other women want, and so the cycle continues. The fashion innovations are remarkable. Roman tailors figure out how to pleat silk, creating those elegant folds that Roman sculpture captures so beautifully. They learn to layer silk with other fabrics, creating contrasts in texture and weight. They experiment with silk dyes, discovering that silk takes color more intensely than wool or linen. Deep purples, rich blues, brilliant reds. Silk becomes a canvas for chromatic experimentation, and all the while the Chinese are watching from afar, amused and satisfied. They're not just selling fabric, they're selling dreams. They're selling the idea that somewhere far to the east there's a civilization so advanced it can produce miracles. The mystique's part of the product, the unknown origins part of the value. If Romans knew silk came from worms eating leaves, would they still pay 14 times its weight in gold? Maybe, maybe not. Better not to risk it. The Romans would spend centuries trying to unlock silk's secrets, never knowing that 15,000 miles away, Chinese emperors guarded sericulture like a nuclear secret, understanding perfectly that this single thread was their greatest power. Upward and northward, transforming societies that touched its waters. The transformation didn't happen all at once. Picture a merchant from Gandhara, somewhere around the year 200, loading his camels with the usual cargo, spices, textiles, perhaps some carved jade. But tucked among his commercial goods, wrapped carefully in cloth, he carried something else, a small bronze Buddha, not for sale, for himself. He'd converted years ago, listening to monks who'd set up shop near the marketplace. Now he traveled with this icon as protection, as comfort, as a connection to something larger than profit margins and desert survival. He wasn't alone. Thousands of merchants like him moved along these routes, and many carried faith with them like an extra provision. Buddhism had been spreading across India for centuries, but it found something special in the Silk Road, a highway of believers, each one carrying Dharma teachings eastward with the same care they gave their most precious cargo. The religion traveled well. Unlike some faiths that demanded territorial control or political power, Buddhism asked mainly for attention and practice. A merchant could be Buddhist in Samarkand, Muslim in Bukhara, and nobody much cared as long as the taxes got paid. This flexibility, this gentle insistence on personal transformation rather than public conformity, made it perfect for the road's multicultural chaos. Monasteries started appearing at oases, first just small compounds, a few meditation cells, a shrine, maybe a well. Merchants would stop, make offerings, rest in the shade of Dharma. The monks provided more than spiritual comfort. They offered literacy, medical care, sometimes arbitration for disputes. They became anchor points in the desert's uncertainty, places where the rules stayed constant even as empires rose and fell around them. The really wealthy merchants did something more. They sponsored entire monastery complexes, funding construction that had outlasted their own memories by centuries. Why? Partly merit. Buddhism taught that generous acts earned karmic rewards. But there's also something else at play. These men spent their lives in transit, never quite belonging anywhere. Building a monastery gave them permanence, their names carved in stone, their generosity remembered in prayers, a way to plant roots in a rootless life. Consider the cave temples that emerged during this golden age. Bamiyan, carved into Afghan cliffs, where two massive Buddha statues eventually stood 55 and 38 meters tall. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, eventually holding nearly 500 grottos filled with painted Buddhist art. Bezeklik in the Turpan Depression, its vivid murals depicting donors and devotees. These weren't built by governments, they were built by merchants, by traders who'd made fortunes on the road and wanted to give something back to the forces, divine or otherwise, that had protected them. The caves served practical purposes too. They provided shelter from sandstorms, cool refuge from summer heat. Travelers could rest there, meditate if they wanted, or simply sleep in the shade of painted bodhisattvas. The monasteries became cultural exchange points, places where Persian merchants met Chinese pilgrims, where Indian monks taught Sogdian students, where languages and ideas mixed like incense smoke. Xuanzang's journey shows how deeply Buddhism had woven itself into the road's fabric. In the year 629, this Chinese monk decided he needed to go to the source, to India itself, to collect authentic Buddhist texts. The versions circulating in China had gaps, contradictions, translation errors accumulated over centuries. So he set out. Despite an imperial ban on foreign travel, the emperor didn't want people leaving China. Xuanzang left anyway. His journey took 17 years. 17 years of walking, of crossing deserts that killed men as casually as stepping on ants, of climbing mountain passes where the air grew so thin that breathing felt like drowning. He traveled because he believed the truth of Dharma mattered more than his own survival. That kind of commitment transforms ordinary travel into pilgrimage, ordinary roads into sacred paths. The journals he kept describe a Silk Road absolutely alive with Buddhist presence. He mentions monastery after monastery, each one a day's journey from the last. He describes communities of monks living in caves, in cities, in mountain retreats. He talks about royal sponsors, merchant donors, common people bringing offerings of food and flowers. Buddhism hadn't just reached Central Asia, it had become Central Asia's spiritual landscape. But faith wasn't the only thing flowing along these routes. Technologies moved too, sometimes changing the world more completely than any religious teaching ever could. Paper. Think about paper for a moment. We're so used to it that we forget what a revolution it represents. Before paper, people wrote on silk, on bamboo strips, on palm leaves, on prepared animal skins, all expensive, all limited. Paper changed everything. It democratized writing, made books possible in quantities that earlier civilizations couldn't imagine. And paper traveled the Silk Road westward, carried by merchants and craftsmen who understood its value. The Chinese had been making paper since the Han Dynasty, centuries earlier, but they guarded the secret carefully. Paper manufacturing gave them an advantage in administration, in record-keeping, in the spread of ideas within their own borders. They didn't want to share. The secret leaked out anyway, as secrets always do on trade routes where people from different worlds constantly mix and mingle. Around the year 750, the story goes, Chinese paper makers were captured during a battle near Samarkand. The victors, recognizing something valuable in these craftsmen's knowledge, set them to work teaching local artisans. Within decades, Samarkand had become a paper-making center, producing sheets that traveled throughout the Islamic world. By the year 800, paper had reached Baghdad. By the year 900, it had reached Egypt. The technology that had been exclusively Chinese became the foundation of Islamic scholarship's golden age. Imagine what that meant. Suddenly, books became affordable. Libraries could grow beyond a few dozen precious volumes. Students could own copies of texts instead of memorizing from a single master copy. Mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, philosophical arguments, all of this could spread faster, reach farther, influence more minds. Paper didn't just carry information, it made information abundant. Mathematics traveled these routes too, though more slowly and with more transformation along the way. The number system we use today, the one you're using right now to count sheep probably, started in India. Indian mathematicians developed zero as a concept, a revolutionary idea that numbers could represent absence as well as presence. They developed positional notation, where the same digit means different things depending on where it sits. 3 in the ones place, 30 in the tens place, 300 in the hundreds place. These ideas reached the Islamic world along the Silk Road, carried by merchants who needed to calculate exchange rates, and by scholars who corresponded across vast distances. Islamic mathematicians recognized the power. The mathematicians who received the system saw its power immediately. They refined it, extended it, built new mathematical structures on its foundation. Then they carried it westward into Europe, where it eventually replaced the clunky Roman numeral system. We call them Arabic numerals in the West, but Arabs call them Indian numerals. The name itself records the journey, the eastward origin and westward spread, a small memorial to the road's role in shaping how we count, how we calculate, how we think about quantity itself. Astronomy traveled too. The Chinese had been observing the heavens for millennia, keeping meticulous records of comets, eclipses, planetary movements. Greek astronomers, inheriting Babylonian knowledge, developed their own models of celestial mechanics. Indian astronomers contributed their own observations and mathematical techniques. All this knowledge converged in the great cities of the Silk Road, in Samarkand, in Baghdad, in cities whose names have been lost, but whose contributions echo through our astronomical understanding. Scholars traded observations the way merchants traded silk. A comet seen from China could be cross-referenced with Persian records. Eclipse predictions could be tested against actual observations from multiple locations. The sky became a shared text, read by different cultures but describing the same reality. This wasn't just academic curiosity. Astronomy meant navigation, calendar keeping, agricultural timing. Understanding the heavens meant mastering time itself. Gunpowder began its long, slow journey westward during this period too, though it wouldn't reach its full destructive potential for centuries yet. The Chinese had discovered that certain mixtures of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal would burn with unusual intensity. First, they used it for fireworks, for celebrations, for displays that painted the night sky with temporary flowers of light. Later, much later, they'd discover its military applications. But in these early centuries, gunpowder was still mainly a curiosity, a substance that merchants mentioned in passing, that found its way into apothecary stocks, that traveled westward without anyone quite realizing they were transporting a technology that had reshaped warfare. The cities themselves became laboratories of cultural mixing. Samarkand in the year 700 held Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, and Jews, all living in their own quarters but meeting in marketplaces, in caravanserais, in the streets where daily life forced interaction. This wasn't always peaceful. Tensions flared, arguments erupted, sometimes violence broke out, but mostly people learned to coexist. They had to. The city's prosperity depended on trade, and trade demanded a certain baseline of cooperation. Language became layered, complex. A merchant operating in Samarkand might speak Sogdian at home, Persian in the marketplace, a bit of Arabic for trading with Muslim merchants from the West, some Chinese for dealing with traders from the East. Children grew up multilingual almost by accident, absorbing languages the way they absorbed dust during sandstorms. It just happened, part of breathing the city's air. Caravanserais evolved into something more than simple inns. They became centers of information exchange, places where merchants from different regions compared notes on road conditions, political situations, market prices. A trader arriving from China might learn that Persian demand for silk softened, but that there's new interest in ceramics. Someone coming from the West might report that a certain mountain pass been blocked by landslide, forcing a detour that added 3 weeks to the journey. The typical caravanserai formed a large square, walls thick enough to provide security, a central courtyard for animals and cargo. Around the courtyard, 2 levels of rooms, ground floor for storage and animal care, upper floor for travelers. A well, always a well, because water meant survival, sometimes a bath, luxury almost beyond description for travelers who'd spent weeks coated in desert dust. Often a small shrine or prayer room, denomination flexible depending on who'd funded the construction. At night, after the animals were settled and the cargo secured, travelers would gather around fires in the courtyard. This is where stories happened, where a Buddhist monk might describe the monasteries of India to a Muslim merchant who'd never traveled further east than Kashgar, where a Nestorian Christian from Syria might hear about the Zoroastrian fire temples of Persia, where Chinese travelers learned about the strange custom of using bread instead of rice, where Persian merchants first heard about tea. These conversations weren't recorded. Nobody wrote down the casual exchanges, the jokes, the questions, the moments of genuine curiosity about how other people lived and thought and prayed. But these conversations mattered. They're where prejudices sometimes softened, where the foreign became familiar, where people discovered that the strange merchants from distant lands laughed at the same jokes, worried about the same things, loved their children with the same fierce protection. Religious pluralism wasn't a philosophy in these cities, it was a practical necessity. You couldn't run a successful trading center while persecuting half your merchants. So cities developed an informal tolerance, a live-and-let-live attitude that must have seemed remarkable to visitors from more homogeneous societies. The Buddhist monastery stood near the fire temple, stood near the mosque, stood near the synagogue. Each community maintaining its own practices while sharing streets and markets with the others. This doesn't mean everything was harmonious. Religious arguments happened constantly. Monasteries competed for wealthy sponsors. Priests and monks and imams argued theology in marketplaces, trying to convert the uncertain. Sometimes these disputes escalated into violence, but the overall pattern held. These cities remained mixed, remained open, because trade demanded it and because no single group was powerful enough to impose uniformity. Translation became an industry. The great texts of each tradition, Buddhist sutras, Zoroastrian scriptures, Greek philosophy, Chinese classics, all needed translation for this multilingual world. Translation centers emerged, usually attached to monasteries or royal courts, where scholars who knew multiple languages worked on texts that had bridged cultural divides. These weren't simple word-for-word translations. Languages don't map onto each other that neatly. A translator had to understand not just vocabulary, but cultural context, philosophical assumptions, the whole worldview embedded in a language's structure. When Buddhist texts moved from Sanskrit to Chinese, translators had to find Chinese concepts that approximated Sanskrit ideas. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they created beautiful misunderstandings that developed into new schools of Buddhist thought. Unique to China, the same process happened in reverse. Chinese administrative techniques, agricultural methods, artistic styles, all this traveled westward, transformed by translation and interpretation. A Chinese painting manual might reach Persia, where artists adapted its techniques to their own aesthetic traditions, creating something neither purely Chinese nor purely Persian, but a genuine hybrid, a new form born from cultural meeting. Medical knowledge flowed in all directions. Chinese medicine, with its theories of qi and meridians, met Indian Ayurvedic traditions. Greek medical texts, preserved and extended by Arab physicians, traveled eastward. Doctors compared notes on treatments, on herbs, on surgical techniques. Not everything translated well. Some medical theories were too embedded in their culture's broader world views. But practical knowledge, the stuff that worked regardless of why you thought it worked, spread quickly. A Chinese doctor might learn about an Indian herb that helped with fever. An Arab physician might discover a Chinese technique for setting broken bones. These exchanges happened informally, in caravanserai conversations, in letters between scholars, in the apprenticeship of doctors who'd traveled to study with foreign masters. Nobody organized it, nobody planned it, but the result was a gradual enrichment of medical knowledge across the entire Silk Road network. Agricultural techniques moved too, sometimes with revolutionary results. New crops reached new regions. Peaches from China found their way to Persia. Cotton cultivation spread northward from India. Grapes that originated in Central Asia reached China, where they transformed Chinese viticulture. Each successful transplant changed local economies, local diets, local agricultural calendars. Musical instruments traveled. The pipa, a Chinese stringed instrument, descended from Persian lutes that had traveled eastward centuries earlier. Persian music incorporated Chinese modal systems. Indian classical music influenced Central Asian performance traditions. Musicians who traveled with caravans, providing entertainment at rest stops, carried melodies and techniques that cross-pollinated into new forms. Even games moved along these routes. Chess, which originated in India as chaturanga, traveled westward and eastward simultaneously, transforming as it went. The Chinese version became xiangqi, with pieces and rules adapted to Chinese military traditions. The Persian version evolved toward modern chess, reaching Europe by the 10th century. Each version reflected the military values and strategic thinking of the culture that adopted it. Textiles became increasingly sophisticated as techniques spread. Chinese silk weaving methods reached Central Asia, where weavers combined them with Persian design sensibilities. The result was textiles more beautiful than either tradition had produced alone, silk with Persian patterns, woven with Chinese techniques, dyed with dyes, whose recipes came from half a dozen different sources. These weren't just commodities, they were collaborative artworks, physical embodiments of cultural synthesis. The speed of transmission varied wildly. Some ideas spread quickly: a new type of sail design, a better harness for pack animals, an improved method for preserving food. These practical innovations had obvious value, and merchants adopted them almost immediately. Other ideas moved slowly, sometimes taking centuries to travel from one end of the road to the other. Philosophical concepts, religious doctrines, aesthetic preferences, these required more than just transmission. They required translation, interpretation, cultural adaptation. Buddhism's spread illustrates this pattern. The religion reached China by the 1st or 2nd century, but it took centuries more to really take root. Early Chinese Buddhists struggled with the faith's foreign concepts. Chinese culture emphasized family, ancestors, social hierarchy. Buddhism emphasized renunciation, monastery life, escape from the cycle of rebirth. These weren't natural fits. Chinese Buddhists had to adapt the religion, emphasizing sutras that resonated with Chinese values, developing new interpretations that made sense within Chinese philosophical traditions. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Chinese Buddhism had become distinctly Chinese, still recognizably Buddhist, still connected to the broader Buddhist world, but shaped by Chinese concerns and expressed in Chinese terms. This adapted Buddhism then traveled to Korea, to Japan, to Vietnam, each region adapting it further, each version reflecting local values while maintaining connection to the original Indian source. The merchant sponsors who made this possible rarely appear in historical records by name. We know they existed because we can see what they built: the monasteries, the cave temples, the translated scriptures, the entire infrastructure of Buddhist learning that spread across Asia. But individual merchants, the men who actually funded this cultural transformation, mostly remain anonymous. They're recorded collectively in vague phrases like pious donors or generous supporters. Occasionally a name survives, an inscription on a cave wall mentioning the merchant who paid for its excavation, a colophon in a manuscript thanking the patron who funded its copying. These fragments hint at the personalities behind the process: successful traders who'd made fortunes dangerous enough to feel grateful for survival, men who wanted their wealth to mean something beyond their own comfort. Think about the psychology involved. You're a merchant who's crossed the Taklamakan Desert 6 times. 6 times you've faced death from thirst, from sandstorms, from bandits, from simple exposure. 6 times you've survived when others didn't. Maybe you think the Buddha protected you. Maybe you think you were just lucky. Either way, you feel you owe something, so you fund a monastery, you commission a translation, you donate money for a new Buddha statue, spiritual insurance against future journeys maybe, or maybe genuine devotion, genuine gratitude for the protection you felt along the road. The monasteries these men built became more than religious centers. They became schools, hospitals, libraries, rest stops, banks. Monasteries held deposits for merchants, since monks were generally trusted, and monasteries provided more security than a tent in a caravanserai. They offered medical care, educated children, settled disputes. They became essential infrastructure for the road's operation, serving secular purposes while maintaining religious identity. This multi-purpose functionality made them resilient. When political winds shifted, when emperors changed religions or invasions disrupted trade, the monasteries often survived. They provided too many services, served too many functions to be easily eliminated. Even rulers who weren't Buddhist found uses for Buddhist monasteries. They made convenient administrative centers, reliable sources of literate staff, neutral ground for diplomatic meetings. The Golden Age didn't last forever, nothing does. By the 9th century, new patterns were emerging. The Islamic world was consolidating, creating its own trade networks that sometimes bypassed the old Silk Road cities. Political instability in Central Asia made some routes dangerous. Climate shifts dried up some oases, forcing route changes. The road would continue for centuries more, but the particular confluence of factors that made the years between 200 and 800 so remarkable, the religious enthusiasm, the technological transfers, the cultural openness, began to fade. But the legacy remained. The Buddhist communities established during this golden age continued for centuries, some surviving into the present day. The technologies transferred, paper-making, mathematical innovations, agricultural techniques, transformed the receiving societies permanently. The pattern of cultural exchange, of ideas traveling alongside goods, became embedded in how Eurasian societies related to each other. In the quiet of a monastery perched on a Silk Road oasis, a Buddhist monk copied a Sanskrit manuscript by candlelight, unaware that he was transcribing the intellectual bridge between continents. Empires in flux, the Silk Road as battlefield and bridge, 800–1200 CE. In 751, at the Battle of Talas, Arab and Chinese armies collided in Central Asia, not directly over territory, but over who'd control the flows of trade and information that bound the medieval world together. The battle itself lasted only 5 days. Chinese forces under General Gao Xianji faced the Abbasid Caliphate's army near the Talas River in what's now Kazakhstan. Historians debate the details. How many soldiers actually fought, whether the numbers were in the thousands or tens of thousands. What we know for certain is the Chinese lost. Their Karluk Turkic allies switched sides mid-battle, and the Tang army collapsed. But here's the thing that matters for our story tonight. Among the Chinese prisoners taken back to Samarkand were skilled papermakers, men who knew the secrets of turning mulberry bark and rags into smooth, durable sheets. Within a generation, paper mills operated throughout the Islamic world. By the year 800, Baghdad had become a center of paper production, rivaling anything in China. One technology transferred through military defeat would reshape human civilization. That's how the Silk Road worked during these centuries. Empires clashed, borders shifted, dynasties rose and crumbled into dust. And through it all, the real story unfolded in the spaces between, in the merchant caravans that kept moving, in the technologies that jumped from one culture to another, in the cities that grew wealthy, regardless of which flag flew above the citadel. Picture the world in the year 600. The Tang dynasties just unified China after centuries of division. In the West, the Prophet Muhammad's still a merchant in Mecca. The Roman Empire, or what's left of it, clings to Constantinople. The stage is set for 4 centuries of transformation that'll reshape 3 continents. Chang'an, modern Xi'an, became the world's largest city. By the year 700, over 1 million people lived within its walls. Walk through its western market district, and you'd hear Persian, Arabic, Sogdian, Turkic, Sanskrit, and a dozen other languages mixing with Chinese. You'd smell cardamom and cinnamon from India, see merchants from Damascus haggling over silk prices, watch Buddhist monks from Central Asia sharing tea with Nestorian Christian priests. The city's layout followed a perfect grid. Each ward had walls and gates that closed at night. The 2 market districts, eastern and western, operated under strict government supervision. Officials set prices, inspected weights and measures, enforced contracts. The Tang government understood something fundamental about trade. Control the markets and you control the wealth. Control the wealth and you control everything else. Foreign merchants couldn't just wander into Chang'an and set up shop. They needed permits, sponsors, official approval. But if you had those things, the opportunities were staggering. A Persian merchant could buy Chinese silk at regulated prices, knowing the quality was guaranteed. A Sogdian trader could store goods in government-inspected warehouses protected by imperial guards. The system worked because everybody benefited. The government collected taxes. The merchants made profits. The consumers got reliable goods at fair prices. This was the Tang dynasty at its height, an empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the edges of modern Afghanistan, an administration so sophisticated it makes medieval Europe look like a collection of warring villages, which, honestly, it kind of was. But empires are fragile things. The Anlushan rebellion began in 755. Just 4 years after that battle at Talas, a general named Anlushan, commanding troops on the northern frontier, decided he'd make a better emperor than the current one. He marched on Chang'an with an army of 200,000 men. The capital fell. The emperor fled. For 8 years, China tore itself apart. Between 10 and 36 million people died. Nobody knows the exact number. Entire provinces were depopulated. The census records from 754 show 53 million people. By 764, that number had dropped to 17 million. Some of that's refugees who weren't counted, people who fled into the mountains or across borders. But most of it was death, starvation, disease, violence, all the horrors that come when social order collapses. The Silk Road didn't stop. It couldn't stop, but it changed. Merchants are practical people. They'd been dealing with unstable governments since humans invented governments. When the Tang dynasty weakened, they adapted. They shifted routes. They found new patrons. They paid protection money to whoever controlled the roads at the moment. Imperial officials, provincial warlords, bandit chiefs, didn't matter. Business is business. The Islamic world was rising as China stumbled. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, controlled territories from Spain to Central Asia. They'd learned from the Persians, who'd learned from the Romans, who'd learned from everyone before them, how to build roads, how to maintain postal systems, how to create financial instruments that let a merchant in Damascus extend credit to a merchant in Bukhara without ever meeting him. Baghdad in the year 800 was arguably the world's intellectual capital. The House of Wisdom, a massive library and research institute, employed scholars who translated Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese texts into Arabic. They preserved knowledge that would have been lost otherwise. When European crusaders finally encountered this learning centuries later, it sparked their own renaissance. But let's not romanticize it. The Islamic Golden Age was golden for certain people in certain places. For the merchant caravans crossing Central Asia, it meant new opportunities and new dangers in roughly equal measure. The geography of power kept shifting. Local dynasties rose in Central Asia, the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks. Each one claimed to be the legitimate heir to ancient Persian greatness. Each one taxed the Silk Road caravans. Each one provided varying levels of protection and infrastructure. The caravanserai system reached its mature form during these centuries. These weren't simple rest stops anymore. They were sophisticated institutions. A typical caravanserai could house hundreds of people and their animals. The design was practical: thick walls for defense, a single gate that could be barred at night, an open courtyard for the animals, rooms around the perimeter for people and valuable goods. Water sources were crucial. Most caravanserais were built near wells or springs, and that water had to be reliable year-round. The better caravanserais offered services we'd recognize today: banking facilities where you could exchange currency or get credit, veterinary care for animals, doctors for humans, scribes who could write contracts or letters in multiple languages, entertainment, musicians, storytellers, sometimes more intimate services that religions officially frowned upon but everyone understood were part of the economy. The spacing between caravanserais followed simple logic. A loaded camel can walk about 20 to 30 miles in a day, so you built rest stations roughly 25 miles apart. The network that emerged wasn't planned by any central authority. It evolved organically, each caravanserai owner competing for business, each one trying to offer better services than the places before and after. Security was the constant obsession. A caravan carrying silk and spices represented enormous wealth. Concentrated, portable wealth, the kind that attracts violent attention. Bandits were a permanent feature of Silk Road life. Small groups might try to ambush isolated travelers. Larger bands operated like businesses, controlling particular mountain passes or desert crossings and demanding payment. Sometimes the line between bandit and legitimate local ruler was pretty blurry. A tribal chief in the mountains might extract taxes from passing caravans. Was that banditry or governance? Depended on whether he provided protection in exchange. Merchants traveled in groups for safety. A typical caravan might have 50 to 100 camels, with guards, servants and merchants, totaling 30 to 50 people. Larger caravans offered more protection, but moved slower and required more coordination. Smaller groups could move faster, but were more vulnerable. The math of trade was brutal and simple. You needed profit margins high enough to cover not just the cost of goods and transportation, but also the regular losses to theft, weather, disease, and political chaos. Silk that cost you 10 dinars in China might sell for 50 in Damascus, if you made it there. If bandits took half your goods, you needed the other half to sell for 100 dinars just to break even. Insurance systems developed to manage these risks. Early forms of maritime insurance existed in the Mediterranean. By the 11th century, similar concepts spread to overland trade. A merchant could pay a fee to a money changer or wealthy patron. If the caravan was robbed, the merchant didn't lose everything. The system worked because it was based on pools of risk. Most caravans made it through. The profits from successful journeys covered the losses from disasters. Merchant guilds formalized these arrangements. These were associations of traders, often organized by ethnicity or religion. Armenian merchants had networks throughout the Silk Road. Jewish traders maintained connections from Spain to China. Sogdian merchants, Central Asians whose language and culture dominated trade for centuries, had communities in every major city. These guilds weren't just social clubs. They provided crucial services. If you were robbed, the guild might lend you money to continue trading. If you died on the road, the guild would help your family. If you had a dispute with another merchant, the guild offered arbitration that was often more reliable than local courts. When you arrived in a strange city, the guild members there would vouch for you, help you find lodging, introduce you to local suppliers and customers. Trust networks held the Silk Road together as much as roads and caravanserais did. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, disrupted everything in ways that rippled across 3 continents. European armies marching to the Holy Land didn't just affect the Middle East, they transformed the entire pattern of Mediterranean trade. Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, provided ships and supplies to the Crusaders. In exchange, they got trading privileges in the conquered territories. Suddenly, Christian merchants had direct access to ports in the Levant, where silk and spices arrived from the east. That should have reduced the importance of the overland Silk Road. Instead, it increased traffic on certain routes, while shifting it away from others. The northern routes through Central Asia became more important. Merchants who'd previously shipped goods through Baghdad and Syria now traveled through Samarkand and across the Caspian Sea. The Crusades made the Mediterranean a war zone for 2 centuries, which drove trade northward. Technology kept flowing. The Chinese had invented gunpowder centuries earlier, but during this period, the knowledge spread westward. By the 13th century, Islamic armies used primitive firearms. Within another century, so did Europeans. The stirrup, which revolutionized cavalry warfare, traveled west from Central Asia. Agricultural techniques moved in both directions. New crops, irrigation methods, animal breeding practices, the most precious commodity was knowledge itself. Medical texts written in Arabic translated Greek and Sanskrit sources that described surgical techniques, herbal medicines, and theories of disease that were centuries ahead of European understanding. Mathematical concepts, including the very idea of zero, traveled from India through the Islamic world. Astronomical observations made in Central Asian observatories improved navigation and timekeeping. And here's something that'll keep you awake if you think about it too much. This entire system operated without any overarching authority. No empire controlled the whole route. No international organization set the rules. No global currency existed. Yet, somehow, a merchant could leave China with silk and trust that through a chain of exchanges, partnerships, and credit arrangements, he could convert that silk into gold in Constantinople. The system was resilient precisely because it was decentralized. When one route became too dangerous, merchants used another. When one dynasty collapsed, they found new patrons. When one city fell to invaders, they moved their operations to the next city over. By the 12th century, the Silk Road network had reached a kind of equilibrium. It wasn't peaceful, violence was constant, it wasn't fair. Exploitation was built into every transaction, but it worked. Goods moved, ideas spread, technologies diffused. The world grew smaller, richer, more interconnected. The Song dynasty in China, though smaller than the Tang had been, achieved remarkable prosperity. Their economy was sophisticated enough to use paper money. Their cities hummed with commerce. They didn't control Central Asia anymore, but they didn't need to. Trade found its way through whatever political arrangements existed. The Islamic world fragmented into competing dynasties and sultanates. The unified caliphate was a memory, but the merchant networks transcended political boundaries. An Arab trader in Cairo could send a letter of credit to a Persian merchant in Merv, and the system honored it. Religion provided a common legal framework. Islamic commercial law was remarkably consistent across vast distances. European merchants were starting to appear in significant numbers by the late 1200s. Marco Polo's the famous one, but he wasn't exceptional. What made him notable was that he wrote about his travels. Plenty of European merchants made similar journeys. They just didn't have the ego or the ghostwriter to produce a bestseller. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, these Central Asian cities were cosmopolitan in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. You could find Hindu merchants from India, Nestorian Christians from Mesopotamia, Buddhist monks from China, Jewish traders from Egypt, all doing business in the same bazaars. They maintained their separate religious practices and identities while participating in a common economic culture. The physical infrastructure of the Silk Road. It's actually pretty minimal. The routes themselves were just paths worn by millions of feet and hooves over centuries. No empire built a continuous road from China to the Mediterranean. What existed was a network of local roads, maintained sporadically by whoever controlled the territory. The caravanserais were often private enterprises. The bridges and wells might be maintained by religious foundations as acts of piety. What held it together was information. Merchants needed to know which routes were safe, which local rulers were trustworthy, where water could be found, what prices were current in distant markets. This information traveled through letters, through conversations at caravanserais, through merchant networks and guild connections. And here's where it gets interesting in a way that feels almost modern. Information itself became valuable. Merchants who knew things others didn't could make better decisions, take smarter risks, earn higher profits. There's a reason so many Silk Road merchants were also scholars, why they patronized libraries and observatories, why they collected maps and wrote travel accounts. Knowledge was power and power was profit. The gradual rise of the Mongols in the late 1100s started as just another tribal movement in the steppes north of China. Nobody could have predicted they'd eventually rule the largest contiguous empire in history, but that's a story for later, for when you're deeper into sleep and ready for tales of conquest and terror. For now, rest here. In the late 12th century, the Silk Road survived the fall of the Tang Dynasty, the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate, the chaos of the Crusades. It's adapted to every challenge. The merchant caravans keep moving through deserts and mountains, carrying silk and spices, transporting ideas and technologies that'll reshape the world. The empires might rise and fall. The dynasties might claim divine mandates and eternal glory. The armies might march back and forth, planting their banners and declaring victory. But the merchant caravans didn't care who claimed the land. They paid their taxes to whoever held military power and moved their goods regardless of imperial flags. For trade's the oldest politics, older than kingdoms, older than gods, as old as the human need to exchange what we have for what we want. The Mongol moment, when an empire embraced the road, 1200 to 1350 CE, the Mongols destroyed cities so thoroughly that survivors thought the world was ending. Yet when the dust settled and Genghis Khan's descendants ruled from the Pacific to the Black Sea, the Silk Road entered its greatest era of safety and prosperity. Picture yourself in Bukhara in the spring of 1219. You're a merchant who's grown comfortable over decades of reasonably stable trade. The Khwarezmian Empire controls these lands, and while taxes are steep and officials corrupt, you know the roads. You understand the systems, you've built relationships. Then someone brings news from the east. A messenger's arrived, dust-caked and terrified, speaking of an army that moves faster than seems possible. Horsemen who don't need supply trains because they drink their mare's blood when provisions run low. A commander who sends envoys first, offering surrender, and when those envoys are killed, as the Shah of Khwarezm foolishly did, responds with methodical annihilation. The Mongols weren't just conquerors, they were architects of a new kind of empire, one that had accidentally created the most connected world humans had ever known. But first, they had to destroy everything. Genghis Khan was born Temujin sometime around 1162 into a world where the steppe spread survivors or corpses. His father was poisoned when he was 9. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to starve on the grasslands. He murdered his half-brother over a fish. These aren't the origins of a philosopher king. They're the crucible that forged someone who understood power in its purest, most stripped-down form. What people miss about Genghis Khan is that he wasn't just a destroyer. He was solving a problem that had plagued the steppes for millennia. How do you unite nomadic peoples who value independence above everything? His answer was brutal but effective. Create a meritocracy based on loyalty and skill. Break up traditional clan structures. Redistribute people into new military units that owed everything to him and nothing to old tribal loyalties. By 1206, he'd united the Mongol tribes. By 1211, he'd turned his attention to China. By 1219, he was ready to deal with the Khwarezmian Empire that controlled much of Central Asia and the richest portions of the Silk Road. The story of how the Mongol invasion started tells you everything about what had come after. Genghis Khan didn't want war with Khwarezm. He wanted trade. He sent a caravan of 500 merchants, Muslims from within Mongol territory, carrying gold, silver, Chinese silk and jade, a peace offering, an opening bid. The governor of Ortra, a border city, decided these merchants were spies. He had them executed and seized their goods. Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors to demand justice and compensation. The Shah of Khwarezm had the chief ambassador killed and sent the other 2 back with their beards burned off, the ultimate insult in both Mongol and Muslim cultures. What happened next wasn't rage, it was something colder. Genghis Khan spent months preparing, gathering intelligence, planning supply routes. When the Mongol army finally moved in 1219, it came like a force of nature. Cities that resisted were erased so completely that grass grew over their ruins. Samarkand fell, Bukhara fell. The great centers of Islamic learning, the repositories of centuries of accumulated knowledge, burned. But here's where the story turns strange. After the conquest, after the terror, something unexpected emerged. Order. The Mongols understood something that previous conquerors hadn't grasped. You can't tax ashes, you can't extract wealth from corpses. If you want to rule a vast empire profitably, you need trade flowing through it like blood through a body. Genghis Khan's vision was practical, not philosophical. He'd grown up on the margins of the Silk Road, watching goods flow past, knowing that whoever controlled that flow controlled wealth itself. He'd seen how fragmented the route had become, with dozens of kingdoms and khanates, each demanding their cut, each creating delays, each adding risk. What if instead one power controlled everything? What if a merchant could travel from the Pacific to the Mediterranean without worrying about changing rulers, shifting alliances, or bandit attacks? That was the promise of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It started with the Yam system. Every 20 or 30 miles along major routes, the Mongols established postal relay stations, simple buildings, not grand, but maintained with military precision. Fresh horses waiting, food supplies, guards who answered directly to the Khan, a courier carrying a paisa, a tablet bearing the Khan's seal, could ride from Karakorum to Kiev in weeks instead of months, changing horses at each station, never stopping except to eat and sleep. Merchants couldn't use the Yam stations unless they had special permission. But the system's existence changed everything. It meant the Khan's attention could arrive anywhere, suddenly. It meant laws were enforced not just locally, but with the full weight of an empire that stretched across most of Asia. Bandits who'd terrorized the Silk Road for generations faced a new calculus: rob a caravan, and you weren't just risking the local garrison's attention, you were risking collective punishment that might wipe out your entire region. The Mongols believed in proportional response, but their sense of proportion was terrifying. Attack a Mongol-protected merchant, and they might execute everyone in the nearest town. It was brutal, it was effective. For the first time in the Silk Road's history, the most dangerous thing you could do was disrupt trade. Picture a merchant in 1240 making calculations that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. He's in Tabriz, in what's now Iran, and he wants to send goods to Khanbalik, what we'd call Beijing. Under the old system, this would have meant negotiating with dozens of different authorities, paying tribute to various kingdoms, hiring guards for the most dangerous stretches, accepting that probably 20% of his goods would be lost or stolen. Now he pays tax once to Mongol officials. He travels under the Khan's protection. If something goes wrong, there's an appeal system. The Mongols created courts specifically for merchant disputes, staffed by people who understood trade law from multiple cultures. This wasn't charity. The Mongols took their cut, and it wasn't small, but it was predictable, and in trade, predictability is worth almost as much as low taxes. The Mongols did something else that seems small but was revolutionary. They standardized weights and measures across their empire. Sounds boring, right? But think about what that meant. A merchant in Hangzhou could quote prices knowing they'd mean the same thing in Samarkand. Contracts became enforceable across vast distances. Trust, that fragile commodity that makes trade possible, became systematized. They also protected merchants in ways that went beyond simple security. Mongol law included provisions specifically designed for traders. If a merchant died on the road, his goods were supposed to be held in trust for his heirs, not seized by local authorities. His son, if weather or bandits destroyed a caravan, the Khan's officials would investigate and sometimes provide compensation. Was this perfectly implemented everywhere? Of course not. The Mongol Empire was vast and varied, and corruption existed like it does in any system. But the intent was clear. Merchants weren't just tolerated, they were valued, essential. Genghis Khan himself had apparently once said something to the effect that merchants were like the wind. They went everywhere, saw everything, and brought news along with goods. He understood information's value. Every merchant returning from distant lands brought intelligence about conditions, prices, political situations, military strengths. The Mongols created what we'd now call an intelligence network, and merchants were crucial nodes in that network. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, took this even further. He completed the conquest of China by 1279, establishing the Han Dynasty. He built a new capital at Khanbalik, and he designed it deliberately to be a crossroads. Wide streets laid out in grids, separate quarters for different merchant communities, markets that were organized and regulated. It was city planning with trade as the central purpose. Kublai also experimented with paper money. Chow, they called it. The concept wasn't new. The Song dynasty had used paper currency, but Kublai made it mandatory across the Mongol Empire. Merchants had to accept it. It was backed by the Khan's authority, which meant it was backed by the most powerful military force in the world. Think about what this meant for trade. Instead of transporting heavy silver or gold across thousands of miles, risking robbery, adding weight to caravans, limiting how much you could carry, a merchant could convert to paper notes. They were easier to hide, lighter to transport, and if you had the Khan's backing, just as valuable. The Polos entered this world at exactly the right moment. Niccolo and Maffeo Polo weren't adventurers setting out to explore. They were Venetian merchants doing what Venetian merchants did, following opportunity. In 1260, they were trading in Constantinople when political upheaval made it dangerous to stay, so they went east, following the Silk Road because it seemed safer than going home. They ended up in Bukhara, waiting out a local war, 3 years. That's how long they spent there, learning languages, making contacts, understanding how Mongol trade worked. When an envoy from Kublai Khan passed through, heading back to China, they asked if they could join. The envoy agreed. Why not? The Khan liked meeting foreigners, especially merchants who knew European markets. They reached Khanbalik in 1206. Kublai was apparently delighted. He'd seen Arab merchants, he'd seen Indian traders, but Venetians were exotic. They were windows into European markets that the Mongols hadn't fully accessed yet. Kublai sent them back to Europe with a request. Bring me educated men. Bring me teachers who can explain your mathematics, your science, your philosophy, and bring me oil from the lamp burning at Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, a gesture showing respect for Christianity, which had adherents within his empire. The Polos returned to Venice in 1269. They delivered the Khan's message. Then in 1271 they headed east again, and this time they brought Niccolo's 17-year-old son Marco. Marco Polo's journey has been romanticized and questioned and analyzed until it's hard to see clearly. Some scholars doubt he actually went to China. Others say he went but exaggerated or borrowed stories. But his account, dictated years later while imprisoned in Genoa, describes something real, the Silk Road, during its absolute peak. What makes Marco's account valuable isn't the exotic details, though those are fun. It's the practical observations. He describes the yam system like someone who's used it. He explains how paper money works, how it's printed, how it's enforced. He catalogues goods moving through markets with the precision of someone who's done inventory. He describes Khanbalik's markets where merchants from Genoa sit next to merchants from Java, everyone negotiating through interpreters or in trade pidgins, simplified languages that emerged wherever commerce happened. He mentions seeing diamonds from India, furs from Siberia, silk from every region of China, spices from the Moluccas, all changing hands in a single day. This was the Mongol moment's promise fulfilled. Global trade, truly global for the first time in human history. The Polos specialized in jewelry, particularly gemstones. They'd buy stones in one market, transport them thousands of miles, and sell them in another where prices were higher. Simple arbitrage, but on a continental scale, and they could do this because the Mongol peace made it possible. Marco apparently spent 17 years in Kubilai's service, traveling throughout the empire on official business. He wasn't an ambassador in the formal sense. He was more like a merchant administrator, someone who understood trade and could report back reliably on conditions in distant provinces. When the Polos finally headed home in 1292, they traveled by sea, escorting a Mongol princess being sent to marry a Persian Khan. The overland route was becoming dangerous again. The empire was beginning to fracture, but maritime routes were thriving. Another Mongol innovation. The Mongols weren't natural sailors. Steppe nomads don't typically take to the sea, but they were practical, and they could see that maritime trade had advantages. It was faster for some routes, it could carry more cargo, and it connected markets that were difficult to reach overland. Kubilai tried invading Japan twice in 1204 and 1281. Both attempts failed spectacularly. Storms destroyed his fleets. But those failures taught Mongol administrators about naval logistics. They didn't become a sea power. but they sponsored maritime trade in ways no previous Chinese dynasty had. Ports like Guangzhou became international cities where you'd hear dozens of languages in a morning walk. Arab merchants established permanent communities. Jewish traders from Baghdad and Persia operated offices. Genoese merchants built warehouses. Armenian Christians served as go-betweens connecting different commercial networks. These weren't temporary camps. These were neighborhoods with mosques and churches and synagogues, with schools teaching in multiple languages, with intermarriage creating families that spanned cultures. The Mongol peace made this possible by creating legal frameworks that protected foreign merchants. You could live in a Mongol city as a foreign trader and expect your property rights to be respected, your contracts to be enforced, your religious practices to be tolerated. This wasn't because the Mongols were enlightened in some modern sense. It was because they'd figured out that diversity was profitable. Banking evolved during this period in ways that would shape commerce for centuries. The concept of letters of credit existed before the Mongols, but they systematized it. A merchant in Tabriz could deposit silver with a Mongol banker and receive a note. That note could be redeemed in Kanbalik for its value in local currency, minus a fee. The Mongol banking system was connected enough that these notes were trusted across the empire. This innovation solved a huge problem. Carrying precious metals was dangerous and limiting. Letters of credit let merchants move wealth as information rather than as physical objects. It's proto-modern banking emerging from practical necessity. The Mongols also standardized coinage in ways that helped regional trade. Different parts of the empire used different currencies, but the exchange rates were published and enforced. A merchant could calculate profits across multiple currency zones with reasonable confidence. All of these systems, postal routes, standardized measures, paper money, letters of credit, protected trade status, combined to create something unprecedented. For a brief window, roughly from 1260 to 1330, trade flowed across Eurasia with a freedom and scale that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Goods that moved during this period tell the story of genuine globalization. Chinese porcelain reached European tables for the first time. Persian carpets became status symbols in Yuan dynasty palaces. Indian cotton textiles dressed people from Baghdad to Hangzhou. Spices from the Moluccas flavored food in Kiev. Furs from Siberia warmed merchants in Cairo. But it wasn't just goods. Ideas moved even faster. Mathematical concepts from India reached Europe through Mongol-controlled territories. Chinese printing technology spread west. Islamic astronomical knowledge reached Chinese scholars. Medical texts were translated from Arabic to Chinese to Latin. The Mongol Empire became a transmission belt for knowledge completely unintentionally. The Khans wanted taxes and trade. What they got was the largest exchange of ideas in human history up to that point. Technology jumped across cultures during this period with dizzying speed. The compass, invented in China for geomancy, became a maritime navigation tool that spread throughout the Indian Ocean. Chinese gunpowder technology reached European hands. Arab irrigation techniques were adopted in Chinese agriculture. The transfer wasn't systematic or planned. It's opportunistic, messy, driven by individual merchants and scholars who saw useful ideas and carried them home. Cartography advanced dramatically because the Mongols needed maps. When you're administering an empire that stretches from the Pacific to the Black Sea, you need to know where things are with precision. Chinese cartographers learned from Arab geographical knowledge. Arab map makers incorporated information from European travelers. For the first time, reasonably accurate maps existed, showing the entire breadth of the Eurasian landmass. These maps weren't just academic exercises. Merchants used them, military commanders studied them, diplomats referenced them. Information that had been fragmentary and local became comprehensive and accessible. The Mongol moment changed how people understood the world's geography. Before, the Silk Road was a series of connected regional networks. Merchants in Venice might have known the route to Constantinople, and Constantinople merchants knew the route to Baghdad, and so on. But few individuals understood the whole system. Under Mongol rule, the entire route became knowable. Travelers could get reliable information about conditions in distant regions. Distance became measurable and manageable in new ways. Population movements during this era were equally dramatic. Armenian merchants, displaced by conflicts in their homeland, spread throughout Mongol territories, becoming essential middlemen between Islamic, Christian, and Mongol commercial networks. They'd convert currencies, translate languages, vouch for merchants from different cultures. They were human bridges. Jewish merchants who'd maintained long-distance trade networks for centuries found new opportunities under Mongol rule. The Mongols didn't care about religious identity the way many previous empires had. They cared about competence and loyalty. Jewish traders thrived in this environment, establishing communities in cities throughout the empire. Genoese merchants competed fiercely with Venetians for access to Black Sea ports that connected to overland Silk Road routes. The Crimean city of Kaffa became a Genoese colony, a European enclave in Mongol territory, where East and West met in every transaction. These merchant communities created their own hybrid cultures. You'd find second-generation Armenian merchants in Khanbalik who spoke Chinese fluently and married Chinese wives, but maintained Armenian churches and trading partnerships. You'd find Genoese traders in Tabriz who dressed in Persian styles and spoke Arabic but maintained their Genoese identities and sent profits back to Italy. Cultural boundaries became fluid in ways that seem remarkable even by modern standards. The Mongol Empire didn't demand cultural uniformity. It demanded loyalty and tax payment. Everything else was negotiable. This tolerance had limits, of course. The Mongols could be brutal toward rebellion or disloyalty. They could be devastatingly cruel to cities that resisted. But once you were inside the system, once you'd accepted Mongol rule, you had remarkable freedom to maintain your own identity while participating in imperial trade networks. Religious diversity within the empire was extraordinary. Kublai's court included Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian priests, and Taoist philosophers. Different religions were patronized. Their festivals celebrated, their texts studied. This wasn't modern pluralism, it's pragmatic tolerance born from ruling diverse populations. The Silk Road during this period carried religious ideas alongside commercial goods. Buddhism spread from Tibet into Mongolia. Islam continued expanding eastward. Nestorian Christianity, which had maintained footholds in Central Asia for centuries, experienced a minor renaissance. European Catholic missionaries traveled east, establishing churches in Chinese cities. But even as the Mongol moment reached its peak, the seeds of its end were already germinating. The empire was too vast to govern as a single unit. Genghis Khan had divided it among his sons and grandsons, creating sub-khanates that theoretically owed allegiance to the great Khan, but increasingly operated independently. By 1330, the unity was fracturing. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China were effectively separate empires. They didn't fight each other constantly, but they didn't cooperate either. The seamless trade route began developing seams again. Military power, which had created the Pax Mongolica, was diffusing. Later generations of Mongol rulers weren't the hardened warriors who'd conquered half the world. They were administrators, courtiers, people who'd grown up in palaces rather than on the steppe. They were often capable rulers, but they didn't inspire the same fear, command the same loyalty. The Black Death, which ravaged Eurasia in the 1340s, traveled along Silk Road routes that the Mongols had made so efficient. Plague-carrying fleas in Central Asian rodent populations found their way onto merchant caravans, which carried them to cities which exploded with infection. The disease reached the Crimean port of Kaffa in 1346 and spread from there throughout Europe. Estimates suggest the plague killed between a third and half of Europe's population. It devastated the Middle East and China as well. The trade routes that had connected the world became vectors for the worst pandemic in human history. The Mongol peace didn't collapse suddenly. It eroded over decades. Trade continued, but it became more dangerous, more expensive, more fragmented. Maritime routes, which had supplemented overland trade during the Mongol peak, began replacing it. Why risk the long overland journey when you could ship goods by sea? By 1400, the Silk Road as a unified system was dying. The Ming Dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols in China in 1368, was less interested in Central Asian trade. They were focused on internal development and coastal commerce. The various Central Asian khanates fought among themselves. Ottoman expansion in the West created new barriers. For a single lifetime, maybe 2 generations at most, the Mongol moment had created something unique. A merchant in 1270, if he'd been lucky and skilled and careful, could have traveled from Hangzhou to Venice with reasonable confidence of arriving alive and with his goods intact. He would have paid taxes, yes. He would have dealt with bureaucracy, with cultural differences, with language barriers. But he would have been protected by the largest empire the world had ever seen, moving through a system designed specifically to facilitate exactly what he was doing. That merchant's grandson, trying the same journey in 1350, would have found a very different road, more dangerous, more expensive, more fragmented. The paradise was closing. The Mongol moment teaches us something about how empires and trade interact. The Mongols didn't set out to create a golden age of commerce. They wanted conquest, tribute, power, but they were smart enough to realize that those things required trade, that wealth flows more reliably from living merchants than from destroyed cities. For a brief window, Self-interest and brutality combined to create conditions where trade could thrive on an unprecedented scale. It wasn't kindness that opened the Silk Road, it was calculation, but the results were transformative. Goods, ideas, technologies, and people moved across Eurasia with a freedom that wouldn't exist again for centuries. The world became knowable in new ways. Distance shrank, possibilities expanded, different cultures encountered each other not as curiosities, but as regular partners in exchange that benefited everyone involved. And then it ended, as all such moments do, because empires don't last forever, and peace is always temporary, and the systems we build to connect ourselves eventually fray and fail. For a single lifetime, a merchant could travel from Beijing to Constantinople under one empire's law, sleeping safely in Caravans, where the Khan's peace was enforced, a paradise that had never existed before and would never exist again. Fracture and fade when the roads divided and alternatives emerged. 1350 to 1453 Sai. By 1350, the unified Mongol Empire was splintering into warring khanates, and the Silk Road that had seemed eternal faced its first existential crisis. What happens when the empire protecting the roots collapses? The question wasn't theoretical. Merchants who'd spent decades building relationships across the vast network woke one morning to find that the safe passage guaranteed by Mongol authority simply didn't exist anymore. The empire that Genghis Khan had forged, that Kublai Khan had expanded, was fracturing along fault lines that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of conquest and control. 4 separate khanates emerged from the wreckage. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes. The Ilkhanate held Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate dominated Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty ruled China, though its grip was weakening with each passing year. They were all descended from Genghis Khan, they all claimed legitimacy, and they all wanted the same thing: control over the trade routes that had made the unified empire wealthy beyond measure. Picture a merchant caravan approaching Samarkand in 1360. Just 10 years earlier, this would have been routine. The city's massive gates would have opened without hesitation. Guards would have checked papers with board efficiency. Taxes would have been paid according to established rates. But now the merchant has to calculate which faction controls the city this month, which set of papers to present, which language to speak first. The wrong choice could mean confiscation, or worse, the cities themselves became prizes in an endless game of military chess. Samarkand changed hands 3 times in a single decade. Bukhara's markets, once humming with activity from dawn till dusk, stood half empty as merchants waited to see which warlord would claim the city next. The great caravanserais that had sheltered thousands of travelers fell into disrepair, their courtyards sometimes occupied by soldiers rather than merchants. But here's what's fascinating about merchant networks. They're remarkably resilient. When one path closes, they find another. When one city becomes too dangerous, they shift operations to a safer location. The Silk Road wasn't a single road after all, it was a web, and webs can lose strands and still function. Jewish merchant families who'd been operating across the network for centuries adapted quickly. They had relatives in multiple cities, spoke multiple languages, and understood that political upheaval was temporary, but trade relationships were permanent. If you couldn't ship goods through Bukhara, you routed through Urgench. If Urgench became unstable, you tried the northern route through the Golden Horde's territory. The goods still needed to move, the demand still existed, you just had to be creative about the path. Armenian merchants did something similar. They built their networks on flexibility and information. They maintained detailed correspondence, updating each other constantly about which routes were safe, which cities had raised tariffs, which warlords could be bribed, and which were unpredictable. These letters, written in cramped script on precious paper, were as valuable as the goods they discussed. But adaptation has limits. By 1370, even the most optimistic merchants had to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed. The volume of trade was declining, the profit margins were shrinking, the risks were increasing. Young merchants who might have once dreamed of crossing the entire Silk Road network now contented themselves with regional trade. Why risk everything on a journey to China when you could make a decent living moving goods between Persia and the Mediterranean? China itself was pulling away. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, had always been somewhat precarious. A Mongol ruling class governing a vast Chinese population that had never fully accepted foreign rule. By 1368, the dynasty collapsed. What replaced it was something completely different. The Ming dynasty came to power with a very specific vision. China first, China secure, China self-sufficient. The new emperor, Hongwu, looked at the chaos in Central Asia and made a calculated decision. Why invest resources in protecting trade routes that led through unstable territories controlled by warring factions? Why expose China to the diseases, the disruptions, the endless complications of international commerce? The Great Wall, which had existed in various forms for centuries, was reinforced and extended not just to keep invaders out, but to create a clear boundary. This is China. Everything beyond is foreign. The message to merchants was equally clear. If you want Chinese goods, you'll trade on China's terms at designated border posts under strict supervision. This was a dramatic reversal of centuries of policy. The Tang dynasty had welcomed foreign merchants. The Song dynasty had built specialized quarters for them. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had actively encouraged international trade. But the Ming, they wanted distance. They wanted control. They wanted China to be, as much as possible, a world unto itself. And yet, the Ming dynasty also produced one of history's most remarkable maritime adventures. A massive fleet, enormous treasure ships that dwarfed anything Europe would build for centuries, and an admiral named Zheng He. Zheng He was a paradox, a Muslim in the service of a Han Chinese emperor, a eunuch commanding military forces, a man born in landlocked Yunnan province who became history's greatest maritime explorer. Between 1405 and 1433, he led 7 massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean, reaching the coasts of India, Arabia, East Africa. His flagship was over 400 feet long. His fleet sometimes included 300 vessels and nearly 30,000 men. These weren't trade missions in the traditional sense. They were demonstrations of power, statements of capability. China saying to the world, we don't need the Silk Road, we have the sea. We can reach you directly. We can project force across oceans. The treasure ships carried Chinese porcelain, silk, and lacquerware. They returned with exotic animals, precious stones, and tribute from distant kingdoms. Zheng He's crew included translators, astronomers, navigators, soldiers, and diplomats. They mapped coastlines, they established diplomatic relations, they impressed foreign rulers with China's technological sophistication. But here's the thing about Zheng He's voyages. They stopped abruptly, completely. After the seventh expedition returned in 1433, the Ming court made a decision. No more treasure fleets, no more expensive naval expeditions. The ships were mothballed, some were deliberately destroyed. The detailed navigation charts and logs were either lost or deliberately suppressed. Why? Partly because the expeditions were phenomenally expensive, partly because Confucian officials at court argued that naval adventures were a distraction from domestic concerns, but mostly because the Ming Dynasty had decided with remarkable consistency that China didn't need the outside world. Self-sufficiency wasn't just a policy, it was an ideology. So, while Zheng He's ships were being dismantled in Chinese harbors, merchants along the Silk Road faced a reality they'd never confronted before. Their primary eastern terminus had essentially closed. You could still trade with China, technically, but the volume was restricted, the enthusiasm was gone. The Middle Kingdom had turned inward. Meanwhile, at the western end of the Silk Road network, another power was consolidating control. The Ottoman Empire, emerging from Anatolia, was expanding rapidly in all directions. They'd captured territories from the Byzantine Empire, they'd pushed into the Balkans, they'd absorbed much of the Middle East, and they had their eyes on the greatest prize of all, Constantinople. The city had been the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. It controlled the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, wealthy, fortified, and symbolically immense. Mehmed II, who became Ottoman Sultan in 1451, was 21 years old and ambitious beyond measure. He wanted Constantinople not just for strategic reasons, but for what it represented, the final proof that the Ottoman Empire was the legitimate successor to Rome itself. The siege began in April 1453. Mehmed assembled an army of perhaps 80,000 soldiers. He brought massive cannons, including one that could fire stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, had perhaps 8,000 men to defend 14 miles of walls. For Silk Road merchants watching these events, the military drama was less important than the economic implications. Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was a gateway. It connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and through the Black Sea to the overland routes that led to Persia, Central Asia, and eventually China. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled access to those routes. The Venetians and Genoese, who'd built their trading empires on access to Eastern goods, understood exactly what was at stake. They sent ships to help defend the city, not because they cared deeply about Byzantine Christianity, but because they needed Constantinople to remain accessible, to remain neutral, to remain a city where merchants could operate according to established rules. On May the 29th, 1453, after nearly 2 months of siege, Ottoman forces breached the walls. Emperor Constantine died fighting. The city fell. Mehmed, now titled the Conqueror, rode through streets littered with bodies and burning buildings. He converted the Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, into a mosque. For merchants, the initial response was panic. Would the Ottomans restrict trade? Would they impose impossible tariffs? Would they cut off access entirely? The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Many of the city's Italian merchants fled. Their warehouses were looted. Their contracts were suddenly worthless. But Mehmed was smarter than that. He understood that Constantinople's value wasn't just military. The city only mattered if it remained a commercial hub. So he issued guarantees. He invited merchants to return. He established new trade regulations that, while favoring Ottoman interests, still allowed commerce to flow. What changed, though, was who controlled that flow. The Ottomans now sat astride the primary route connecting Europe to the east. They could tax goods moving through their territory. They could favor certain merchants over others. They could, if they wished, make life very difficult for Italian merchants who had grown accustomed to preferential treatment. European merchants did the math. The overland Silk Road was increasingly fragmented and dangerous. The primary eastern terminus in China had essentially closed itself off. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the crucial Mediterranean to Black Sea passage, and the goods they wanted, spices especially, but also silk, porcelain, gems, dyes, were becoming more expensive and harder to obtain. There had to be another way, and a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe thought it had found one. Portugal was nobody's idea of a great power. Small population, limited resources, positioned on the Atlantic coast facing an ocean that medieval European sailors considered dangerous and largely useless. But Portugal had Prince Henry, known to history as the Navigator. Though he himself rarely went to sea, Henry was obsessed with finding a sea route around Africa to reach the Indies directly. No Ottoman middlemen, no Silk Road tolls, no dependence on Central Asian politics, just Portuguese ships sailing down the African coast around the southern tip and straight to the source of spices and silk. Sounds simple, doesn't it? It wasn't. The African coast was largely unmapped. The winds and currents were unpredictable. Ships that ventured too far south often failed to return, but Henry was patient. He established a navigation school. He sponsored expedition after expedition. Each voyage pushed a little further south. Each returned with new information about winds, coastlines, and navigation techniques. By the 1430s, Portuguese ships were reaching the western bulge of Africa. By the 1450s, they'd mapped most of the West African coast. The southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, wouldn't be rounded until 1488, but the principle was established. Sea routes could replace land routes. Maritime technology could circumvent traditional networks. Other European powers took notice. The Spanish, watching Portugal's progress, started their own exploration programs. Venice and Genoa, their traditional Mediterranean dominance threatened by Ottoman control, began investing in alternative routes. The age of maritime exploration was beginning, and with it the gradual eclipse of the overland Silk Road. But let's not pretend this transition was smooth or obvious at the time. In 1450, the Silk Road was still functioning. Diminished? Yes. More dangerous and less profitable than before. But goods still moved. Merchants still made the journey. The great cities of Central Asia were declining, but they hadn't disappeared. What was disappearing was the system that had supported the Silk Road, the idea that a single empire or alliance of powers could guarantee safe passage from the Mediterranean to China, the assumption that overland routes were superior to maritime ones, the belief that the great entrepôt cities of Central Asia were permanent fixtures of the commercial landscape, merchants who'd spent their entire lives learning the Silk Road network had to make difficult decisions. Do you adapt? Do you invest in learning about maritime trade, about ships and tides and navigational techniques? Or do you stick with what you know, hoping that the overland routes will recover? Some adapted brilliantly. Armenian merchant families, for instance, established themselves in both Central Asian cities and Mediterranean ports. They could operate in both worlds. Jewish merchants did something similar, maintaining networks that spanned from Venice to Persia to India. These flexible, multi-regional networks survived the time others couldn't adjust. Families that had specialized in particular routes or cities found their expertise suddenly obsolete. The man who knew every caravanserai between Samarkand and Beijing discovered his knowledge was worth less with each passing year. The merchant who'd built his entire operation around moving silk from China to the Mediterranean watched as his margins shrank and his risks multiplied. The cities tell the story most clearly. Samarkand, which had been among the world's greatest urban centers, entered a long decline. The trade that had sustained it was diverted elsewhere or replaced by maritime routes. The magnificent buildings remained, but the crowds that had filled the bazaars grew smaller. The caravanserais that had sheltered thousands of merchants annually stood half empty. Bukhara experienced something similar. The madrasas continued teaching, the mosques continued operating, but the commercial vitality that had made these cities wealthy was draining away. There's a particular kind of sadness watching a great city decline, not because of conquest or plague, but because the economic currents that sustained it have simply shifted. Venice, though, was taking notes. Venetian merchants had been trading with the East for centuries. They'd built relationships with Arab merchants, Persian intermediaries, and the occasional intrepid trader who'd actually made it to China and back. They understood, better than perhaps anyone else in Europe, how the Silk Road network functioned, and they were writing it down. Detailed accounts of trade routes, lists of commodities and prices, notes on local customs, currencies, and political situations. These documents, preserved in Venetian archives, would later prove invaluable to historians. But at the time they served a more practical purpose. Institutional memory. Venice was recording how the old system worked, even as that system was failing, because understanding what had been was the first step toward building what would come next. The transition from overland to maritime trade wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people in response to particular circumstances. If the Ming Dynasty had continued supporting international commerce, if the Mongol successor states had managed to maintain stable control over Central Asian trade routes, if the Ottoman Empire had kept Mediterranean trade more open, then maybe the Silk Road would have continued as the primary conduit for East-West exchange. But that's not what happened. And by the middle of the 15th century, even the most conservative merchants recognized that the future of long-distance trade was on the water. Silk itself was declining as the primary trade commodity. Europe was learning to produce its own silk. Italian cities had silk industries. Spain was developing them. The techniques that had once been Chinese secrets were now widely known. Silk still had value, certainly, but it wasn't the transformative luxury it had been centuries earlier. Spices, though, spices were different. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These still came from specific regions in South and Southeast Asia. They couldn't be easily replicated, and European demand for them was enormous and growing. Whoever could secure direct access to spice sources could command extraordinary profits. The Portuguese understood this. Their exploration of the African coast wasn't just about navigation and discovery. It was about bypassing the Ottoman-controlled routes and establishing direct access to the spice islands of Indonesia. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded Africa and reached India in 1498, he was completing a process that had begun decades earlier, the replacement of the Silk Road with the spice route. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1453, those later developments were still decades away. What was clear then was simply that the old system was failing. The unified network that had stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific was fragmenting into regional systems that barely connected. Chinese goods still reached Europe, Persian carpets still sold in Italian markets, but the merchants moving those goods were working within a new reality. They weren't traversing a stable network protected by a single dominant power. They were navigating a fragmented landscape where every border crossing required new negotiations, where routes that had been safe for decades suddenly became dangerous, where the old relationships and guarantees simply didn't apply anymore. Some historians date the end of the Silk Road to the fall of Constantinople. Others point to earlier events, the collapse of the unified Mongol Empire or the Ming dynasty's isolationist turn. Still others argue that the Silk Road never really ended, it just transformed into something else. There's truth in all these perspectives. What ended in the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't trade between East and West. That continued. What ended was a particular system of conducting that trade, a system based on overland routes, on caravan networks, on the great entrepot cities of Central Asia serving as meeting points between different commercial worlds. The merchants of that era didn't experience this as historical transition. They experienced it as difficulty, as uncertainty, as the erosion of certainties they'd taken for granted. Imagine spending 20 years building a business based on moving goods along a particular route, developing relationships with suppliers and customers, learning the local languages and customs, only to have the entire framework suddenly become unreliable. Some gave up, some retired, some lost everything, but others adapted. They learned about ships, they established partnerships in coastal cities, they shifted from overland trade to maritime commerce. They figured out how to operate in the new world that was emerging. This adaptability, this merchant flexibility, is one of the lasting legacies of the Silk Road. The network taught merchants to operate across cultural boundaries, to adapt to different political systems, to remain flexible in the face of change. Those skills didn't become obsolete when the routes shifted, they became even more valuable. By 1450, a young merchant in Venice choosing a career had options his grandfather hadn't faced. You could still, theoretically, engage in overland trade with the East, but the smart money was betting on maritime routes, on ships that could carry more cargo more safely than any camel caravan, on navigation techniques that were improving with each passing year, on a future where the Mediterranean connected not to overland routes through Central Asia, but to ocean routes around Africa and eventually across the Atlantic. The world was getting bigger and smaller simultaneously. Bigger because Europeans were discovering or rediscovering vast coastlines and ocean passages. Smaller because maritime trade was faster and more efficient than overland caravans. A ship could carry in its hold what would require hundreds of camels, and it could make the journey in a fraction of the time. But there's a melancholy to this story, isn't there? The Silk Road at its height was extraordinary, not just as a commercial network, but as a cultural phenomenon. The great cities where Chinese met Persian, met Arab, met Indian, met European, the caravanserais, where travelers from across the known world shared stories and knowledge. The transmission not just of goods, but of ideas, technologies, art forms, religious traditions. That kind of sustained overland connection between civilizations wouldn't happen again. Maritime trade was efficient, but it was also isolating. Sailors on ships didn't have the same opportunities for cultural exchange as merchants traveling overland. Port cities became cosmopolitan, yes, but the interior regions, the great steppes and the deserts the Silk Road had crossed, became peripheral, just forgotten. The Mongols, brutal as they were, created something unique. A merchant could travel from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under a single authority. That unity was brief, brutal, deeply flawed, but it existed, and when it ended, something irreplaceable was lost. In 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, merchants didn't mourn some abstract empire. They calculated new sea routes, adjusted their partnerships, prepared for a world where the caravanserai would be replaced by the caravel, and where spice routes would matter more than silk routes. The age of the horse was ending, the age of the ship was beginning. Echoes and eternity, what the Silk Road left behind. The caravans stopped coming, the caravanserais crumbled into dust, and yet the Silk Road never truly closed. It just transformed into maritime routes, then railways, then airports, each generation of merchants following the same principle their ancestors understood: connections, commerce, and commerce changes everything. Picture the last merchant caravan arriving at a caravanserai in Samarkand, sometime around the year 1470. The keeper didn't know it'd be the last. The merchants didn't announce they wouldn't return. They just chose a different path next season, one that led to port cities instead of desert routes. The caravanserai keeper waited, repaired the walls, kept water in the cisterns, but the merchants never came back. And gradually, without ceremony or declaration, 1,000 years of continuous traffic just stopped. That's how the Silk Road ended, not with a battle or a proclamation, but with thousands of individual choices accumulating into silence. But here's what's strange. Walk through Istanbul today, and you'll find merchants selling carpets using techniques refined across centuries of Silk Road trade. Visit Bukhara, and craftsmen still create ceramics with designs that traveled from China to Persia and back again, each journey adding layers. The roads themselves became grass-covered trails, the caravanserais turned to ruins, yet the connections they'd created never quite dissolved. They changed shape, became invisible, transformed into cultural DNA that still expresses itself in how we live. The Silk Road didn't die, it became something harder to see but easier to experience. Think about language. something most of us barely notice but use every moment we're awake. When you say orange, you're speaking Persian, the word passing through Arabic and French before reaching English. Sugar traveled the same route from Sanskrit through Persian and Arabic. Caravan itself, bazaar, checkmate, these are Silk Road words that merchants carried along with their silk and spices. They're linguistic footprints, proving that ideas traveled as reliably as goods. Every time you talk about an algorithm, you're honoring Al-Khwarizmi, the Persian mathematician whose name became a word. Every time you use zero, you're employing a concept that traveled from India through the Islamic world into Europe via merchant networks. Language became one of the Silk Road's most persistent legacies. Words don't need caravans. Once they arrive, they just stay, embedding themselves into daily speech until no one remembers they came from somewhere else. Think about the technologies you use without thinking about them. Paper, see, that came from China, carried westward by merchants and prisoners of war who knew the secrets of its manufacture. Europeans didn't invent it. They learned it from Islamic craftsmen who'd learned it from Chinese sources, the knowledge traveling incrementally, workshop to workshop until every monastery in Europe was copying manuscripts on material that would have been impossible luxury a few centuries earlier. Printing followed the same path. The Chinese had movable type centuries before Gutenberg, but it was the Silk Road's cultural exchange that created the conditions for printing to revolutionize Europe. Ideas about mechanical reproduction, ink formulations, the very concept that you could mass-produce written material, these traveled the routes even when the routes themselves were dangerous, disrupted, barely functional, and gunpowder. The technology that ended the era of castles and armored knights, that changed warfare so fundamentally that nothing was ever the same, that came from Chinese alchemists seeking immortality, carried westward by Mongol armies and Turkish traders, until European craftsmen figured out how to make it themselves. The Silk Road didn't just carry luxury goods. It carried the technologies that had reshaped civilizations. Mathematics traveled the same invisible highways. The decimal system, trigonometry, algebraic concepts, these moved from Indian scholars to Islamic mathematicians to European universities, each culture adding refinements, each generation building on foundations laid by people they'd never meet. When you calculate anything, you're using systems refined by centuries of exchange. The numbers themselves are called Arabic numerals in the West, though Arabs called them Indian numerals, acknowledging their source. Even our mathematical notation remembers the Silk Road. Humbling, isn't it, to realize how little we invented ourselves, how much we inherited from people whose names we'll never know, whose faces are lost to time, but whose insights still structure our thinking. Philosophy and religion carried even deeper transformations. Buddhism reached China because merchants created the conditions for monks to travel. The religion adapted as it moved. Chinese Buddhism looks different from Indian Buddhism, which looks different from Japanese Buddhism. Each culture along the Silk Road took the teachings and reshaped them to fit local needs, local philosophies, local sensibilities. What emerged wasn't corruption of an original truth, but a living tradition that proved flexible enough to survive precisely because it could change. Islamic philosophy absorbed Greek texts that had been lost to Europe, preserving them through centuries when European scholarship had contracted. When those texts finally returned to Europe, carried by merchants, translated by scholars working in Silk Road cities, they sparked the Renaissance. Aristotle reached medieval European universities through Arabic translations preserved in Baghdad and Cordoba, cities that thrived because of Silk Road wealth. The intellectual foundation of Western philosophy, in other words, survived because Islamic scholars maintained it during Europe's difficult centuries. You can trace this exchange in art and architecture. Look at European gardens designed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of them deliberately mimic Chinese and Persian styles that European merchants described after traveling eastern routes. Look at Islamic architectural geometry, and you'll find mathematical principles that influenced Gothic cathedrals. Look at Buddhist cave paintings in Central Asia, and you'll see Greek artistic influence mixing with Indian religious themes and Chinese technical skill. Art became a visual record of exchange, every painting and building holding evidence of connection. The merchant networks themselves didn't disappear, they adapted. When Portuguese ships reached India, bypassing the overland routes entirely, it seemed like the Silk Road had become obsolete. But look closer. The same merchant families that had managed overland trade just shifted to maritime commerce. Venetian traders who'd grown wealthy on Silk Road goods became investors in Portuguese and later Dutch trading companies. The business model stayed remarkably consistent. Understand what people want in distant places, manage the risks of long-distance transport, maintain relationships across cultural boundaries, profit from connecting supply with demand. Modern corporations follow this same logic. When a tech company manufactures components in 12 different countries before final assembly, it's following patterns established by merchants who sourced silk from China, had it woven in Persia, and sold it in Rome. The scales incomprehensibly larger, the speed impossibly faster, but the fundamental principle hasn't changed. Specialization and exchange create wealth. Connection creates opportunity. These lessons learned over centuries of camel caravans still drive global commerce. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive modern infrastructure project, explicitly references Silk Road heritage. It's not coincidence or clever marketing. Chinese planners recognize they're continuing something that worked for millennia, connecting resource-rich regions with markets, using infrastructure investment to enable trade, accepting that commerce creates cultural exchange whether you plan for it or not. The modern version uses high-speed rail and fiber optic cables instead of camels and caravanserais. But merchants in the year 700 would have understood the strategy perfectly. Even the routes themselves persist in transformed states. The Trans-Siberian Railway roughly follows ancient northern branches. Modern highways in Central Asia often trace paths that were trade routes 2,000 years ago because geography hasn't changed. The mountain passes and river valleys that made sense for camel caravans still make sense for trucks. Airlines connect the same cities that Silk Road merchants connected because economic logic persists across centuries. Istanbul remains a crucial junction, not for caravans, but for shipping and air traffic. Geography constrains and enables us the same way it did our ancestors. What's remarkable isn't that the Silk Road declined. What's remarkable is how completely its principles survived its physical decline. Think about the languages spoken in Central Asian cities today. You'll hear Russian and Chinese, Uzbek and Tajik, Turkish and Persian, echoes of every empire that controlled sections of the Silk Road. These cities are linguistically diverse because centuries of trade made multilingualism a survival skill. The practical polyglottism that helped merchants negotiate deals became cultural heritage that outlasted the merchants themselves. Today's residents speak multiple languages not because of trade necessarily, but because their ancestors needed to, and the habit became identity. Cultural festivals along the old routes still celebrate merchant heritage. Cities in Uzbekistan host tourist festivals featuring reconstructed caravanserais and people dressed as ancient traders turning history into performance. But beneath the tourist spectacle, there's genuine pride. These cities remember when they were crucial nodes in world commerce, when being on the Silk Road meant being cosmopolitan, sophisticated, wealthy. That memory matters to them. It shapes civic identity in ways that persist long after the economic rationale disappeared. Museums across Central Asia preserve Silk Road artifacts with deep reverence, not just as tourist attractions, though they serve that purpose, but as proof of historical importance. These collections say, we mattered, the world flowed through here, we weren't peripheral, and they're right. For centuries, Central Asian cities were more cosmopolitan than European capitals, more diverse than most places on Earth, more crucial to global commerce than almost anywhere else. That history doesn't just disappear because trade routes shifted. Consider the human qualities the Silk Road required and therefore reinforced. Merchants needed patience. Journeys took months or years, and nothing rushed the camels. They needed cultural flexibility. Survival depended on reading unfamiliar social situations, adapting to different customs, respecting practices they didn't necessarily understand. They needed risk tolerance. Every journey carried possibilities of banditry, disease, political upheaval, natural disaster. They needed long-term thinking. Investments wouldn't pay off for years. Relationships required decades to mature. Reputation accumulated slowly but mattered enormously. These qualities became cultural values in Silk Road cities. The ability to wait, to adapt, to manage uncertainty, to think in generations rather than quarters, these weren't just merchant skills, they were civic virtues. And you can still see them in Central Asian culture today. The hospitality traditions, the emphasis on long-term relationships over quick profit, the multilingual flexibility, the comfort with diversity, these are Silk Road inheritances as real as any building or artifact. The caravanserais themselves, even in ruins, teach persistence. They're scattered across thousands of miles, most of them crumbling, many of them barely recognizable, but they're still there, stone and brick outlasting the people who built them, the merchants who used them, the empires that maintained them. Archaeologists keep discovering new ones, hidden in deserts or overgrown by vegetation. Each discovery confirms what written records suggested. The network was vast, redundant, resilient. One route closing didn't stop trade, it simply redirected it. One caravanserai falling into disrepair didn't end journeys. Merchants just stopped 10 miles earlier or later. That physical redundancy paralleled economic redundancy. The Silk Road never depended on any single path, any particular city, any specific technology. It was a network, and networks survived damage that would destroy linear systems. When Mongol armies destroyed cities, trade rerouted. When plague devastated populations, survivors rebuilt commerce. When political changes made certain routes dangerous, merchants found alternatives. The system adapted because it had to and because it could. This adaptability, this resilient redundancy, became a model that modern supply chains still try to emulate. Every time a company talks about diversifying suppliers or creating backup logistics, they're following Silk Road logic. Don't depend on one route. Don't trust that conditions won't change. Build flexibility into the system from the beginning. These aren't new insights. Merchants understood them 1500 years ago because the ones who didn't understand them went bankrupt or died in deserts. The Silk Road's greatest legacy might be its proof that humans will always seek connection. Every time political boundaries hardened, merchants found ways around them. Every time languages differed, traders developed pidgins or hired translators. Every time distances seemed impossible, someone figured out how to cross them profitably. The desire to exchange goods, yes, but also ideas, stories, techniques, art, philosophy, that desire appears to be fundamental to human nature. We're a trading species. We always have been. This isn't romantic idealism. It's observable pattern across all of human history. Even when governments try to enforce isolation, black markets develop. Even when ideologies demand self-sufficiency, people smuggle foreign goods. Even when regulations prohibit certain exchanges, workarounds emerge. The Silk Road succeeded for centuries, not because anyone in power particularly wanted it to, but because millions of individuals made small decisions to trade, to travel, to connect. Governments could help or hinder, but they couldn't stop it. Only technological change, the development of maritime routes that were simply more efficient, could shift the pattern. And even then, the pattern didn't stop. It just changed form. Maritime trade followed Silk Road logic almost exactly. Portuguese and Dutch merchants created trading posts in distant ports, the same way Silk Road merchants created relationships in distant cities. They learned local languages, adapted to local customs, married into local families, built networks of trust that transcended cultural boundaries. The ships were new, the routes were new, but the human element remained consistent. Trust mattered more than contracts. Reputation determined access to opportunities. Patience and cultural flexibility separated successful merchants from failed ones. When railways arrived, the pattern repeated itself. The Trans-Siberian Railway opened Russian access to East Asian markets using technology that would have seemed magical to ancient merchants, but the economic logic, pure Silk Road, connect distant markets, enable specialization, reduce transportation costs, profit from the exchange. Russian merchants sold timber and furs eastward, bought tea and silk westward, built fortunes using principles that hadn't changed since camel caravans. Air freight brought the latest transformation. Now goods that once took years to transport arrive in days. Flowers cut in Kenya appear in London shops the next morning. Electronic components manufactured in Taiwan reach assembly plants in Mexico within hours. The speed's unprecedented, the scale unimaginable to ancient merchants, but the fundamental dynamic, specialization enabled by efficient transport creating wealth through exchange. That's unchanged. And now digital trade creates exchanges that don't require physical transportation at all. Software developed in India serves American customers. Movies made in Korea stream to African audiences. Music produced in Jamaica influences Japanese artists who sell to Brazilian fans. The Silk Road's logic has expanded beyond physical goods to encompass anything that can be digitized, anything that can move at light speed through fiber optic cables. Yet for all this technological change, the human element persists. Digital merchants still need cultural flexibility to reach global markets. They still need patience to build businesses that scale slowly. They still need risk tolerance to try approaches that might fail. They still benefit from network effects, from reputation, from trust accumulated over time. The technologies change, but we don't change as much as we think we do. Walk through any modern city, and you're surrounded by Silk Road legacies you probably don't notice. The cafe serving coffee from Ethiopia and tea from China, Silk Road principle. The restaurant offering Italian pasta with tomato sauce, combining ingredients from 3 continents, Silk Road principle. The clothing store selling designs from France made with fabric from Egypt, assembled in Vietnam, pure Silk Road. The bookstore carrying translated novels, making Korean or Arabic or Swedish stories available in English, same exchange logic, different medium. Your own life's built on Silk Road foundations. The phone you use contains components from dozens of countries. The ideas that shape your thinking come from philosophical traditions that mixed and merged along trade routes. The food you eat combines agricultural innovations developed on different continents. The art you enjoy shows influences that traveled thousands of miles before reaching you. You live in a world the Silk Road created, a world where connections normal, where diversity is unremarkable, where goods and ideas flow constantly across boundaries that once seemed absolute. This is the deepest legacy, not the physical artifacts, though those matter, not the specific technologies, though those transformed civilizations. The deepest legacy is the assumption that connection's possible, that distance can be overcome, that differences can be bridged. For most of human history, that wasn't obvious. Before the Silk Road proved it consistently, the idea that you could routinely exchange with people thousands of miles away, speaking different languages, following different customs, it seemed impractical at best. The Silk Road made it normal, and once something becomes normal, it becomes foundational. You build your civilization on it without quite realizing you're doing so. The merchants who created this, who maintained it through centuries of difficulty and danger, deserve recognition they rarely receive. History remembers conquerors and kings, philosophers and prophets. It forgets merchants. But the merchants did something arguably more important than any conquest. They created the infrastructure of connection that made cross-cultural learning possible. They risked their lives and invested their wealth, not because they were heroes, but because they were practical people seeing opportunities. Their practicality changed the world more thoroughly than most heroism. So, when you think about the Silk Road, don't picture just caravans and camels. Picture the accumulated weight of millions of small decisions to reach across difference, to risk connection, to believe that exchange is worthwhile. Picture the patience of merchants waiting months for caravans to return. Picture the courage of people traveling into completely unfamiliar territory with nothing but goods and hope. Picture the flexibility of traders learning their fifth or sixth language because business required it. Picture the vision of people who invested in relationships they wouldn't live to see fully mature. These people weren't extraordinary in any individual sense. They were ordinary humans doing what humans do, trying to improve their circumstances, provide for their families, build something that lasts. But their accumulated ordinary choices created extraordinary results. They wove a world together, and the world they wove never completely unraveled. The caravanserais crumbled, the roots grew over with grass, the merchant families died out or adapted to new circumstances. But what they created, the habits of connection, the assumption of exchange, the infrastructure of trust that makes global commerce possible, that survived. It's in the words you speak, the technologies you use, the ideas that feel self-evident but were actually learned. It's in every moment you benefit from specialization made possible by trade, from diversity made normal by centuries of exchange. In your morning coffee from Ethiopia, your smartphone from Korea, your ideas inherited from Buddhist philosophy and Islamic mathematics, you're using silk roads that never closed. They only changed form as they always have, as they always will. The deepest knowledge, what merchants knew that empires forgot in the quiet before sleep. Consider what the Silk Road merchants understood that emperors, generals, and scholars often missed, that the smallest transactions between two humans trying to improve their lives can reshape civilizations. Strange thought, isn't it? We've spent hours together exploring the grand sweep of history, empires rising and falling, armies marching across deserts, religions spreading like water, finding new channels through rock, but the men who actually made it all happen weren't thinking about grand sweeps. They were thinking about profit margins, about whether their camels could handle another week's travel, about whether the merchant they'd just met could be trusted with credit until spring. They were just trying to make a living, and yet somehow their efforts created something no emperor ever managed through conquest. They built bridges between civilizations that no army could destroy. They spread ideas more effectively than any missionary. They created networks of trust that survived wars, plagues, and the collapse of entire kingdoms. How'd they do it? Picture a merchant sitting by his campfire tonight, not one of the famous ones we've talked about, but a completely ordinary trader whose name history never bothered to record. He's maybe 40 years old. His back hurts from decades of camel saddles. His hands are weathered from handling ropes and goods in every kind of weather. He can calculate exchange rates in 7 languages, most of which he can't actually speak beyond the basic vocabulary of commerce. He keeps a journal, this merchant, not because he thinks he's making history, but because he needs to track his expenses. Tomorrow he'll write down how many strings of copper cash he spent on fodder for his animals, how much a local guide charged to show him the safe path around a bandit-controlled valley, the price of lamp oil in this particular town on this particular day. Boring details, the kind that makes your eyes glaze over when you're trying to read historical documents. But here's what he understood that the emperors never quite grasped. Every transaction is a relationship. Every exchange of goods is an exchange of trust. You can't force someone to give you a fair deal at sword point. Not really, not in a way that creates a relationship you can come back to next year and the year after that. The merchant knows the shopkeeper he's bargaining with today needs to make a profit too. That the guide who's overcharging him for directions actually does know the terrain better than anyone else. That the innkeeper who seems to be gouging him on room prices is also the only person in 50 miles who'll let a foreign trader sleep safely behind locked doors. So he pays. He negotiates. Sure, that's part of the dance. But he pays fair prices because he plans to come back. That's the first deep truth the merchants understood. Commerce isn't extraction, it's circulation. Money moves in circles, goods flow like water, always seeking new channels. The merchant who tries to grab everything today has nothing tomorrow. The merchant who leaves a little profit for everyone else creates a network of people who'll help him when he needs it. Empires never quite learned this lesson. They thought in terms of conquest and tribute, take what you can, hold what you must. The idea that you might prosper more by helping your trading partners prosper seemed weak to them, soft, the kind of thinking that lost wars. But merchants didn't need to win wars, they just needed to survive them. And survival required a different kind of intelligence, the kind that understands what people actually want versus what they say they want, the kind that can read the tiny signals of body language across cultural barriers. The kind that knows when to press an advantage and when to accept a small loss to preserve a valuable relationship. Consider what it took to be a successful merchant. You're dealing with people who speak languages you don't fully understand, who worship gods you've never heard of, who have customs and taboos you can't even begin to predict. You're carrying goods worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, traveling through regions where law enforcement is sporadic at best. How do you do it? How do you trust anyone? The answer is carefully, gradually, with a sophisticated understanding of risk that modern economists wouldn't develop formal theories about for another 1,000 years. A merchant traveling from Chang'an to Samarkand couldn't just show up with a caravan full of silk and hope for the best. He built networks. He cultivated relationships over years, sometimes decades. He sent small shipments first to test the reliability of new partners. He diversified his investments across multiple ventures so one disaster wouldn't ruin him completely. He understood probability without ever studying mathematics. He knew that 3 dangerous journeys out of 10 failed. So he made sure his profits on the 7 successes covered his losses on the 3 failures. He knew that weather and bandits and disease were unpredictable, but over many journeys they averaged out to something manageable. This wasn't just smart business. This was a fundamental insight into how the world works, that randomness follows patterns. That uncertainty can be managed even if it can't be eliminated. That patience and consistency beat bold gambles almost every time. The nights deepened around our imaginary merchant. His fires burned down to coals. The other traders in the caravanserai have settled into sleep, their breathing synchronizing with the gentle sounds of animals resting. And lying there under stars so bright they seem close enough to touch, perhaps this merchant reflects on what he's learned through years of travel, not just about trade routes and price fluctuations, but about people, about what connects us despite our differences. He's discovered something that missionaries sometimes miss in their zeal and that conquerors never understand at all. People everywhere want fundamentally similar things: safety for their families, enough to eat, something beautiful to look at occasionally, the respect of their neighbors. a sense that their work matters. These desires transcend culture. They're deeper than religion, more persistent than political systems, and they create the foundation for trade, because here's the thing. If everyone everywhere wanted exactly the same things, there'd be no reason to trade. If every region produced identical goods, merchants would have no purpose. The Silk Road existed because different places had different resources, different skills, different ideas about what constituted beauty or utility or luxury, but those differences only mattered because underneath them was similarity. The Chinese emperor who wanted Persian carpets and the Persian Shah who wanted Chinese silk were expressing the same human desire for beautiful things that came from far away. The Buddhist monk seeking texts from India and the Islamic scholar seeking astronomical tables from China were both pursuing knowledge about the universe. Trade worked because of difference built on foundation of similarity. Our merchant understood this in his bones. He'd seen too many places, met too many people, learned too many languages to believe that his own culture had a monopoly on wisdom or virtue or ingenuity. He knew that the barbarians in the next valley over were just people trying to feed their families, that the infidels in the distant city were just believers following a different path to the same fundamental questions about existence and meaning. In the foreign temple were seeking the same divine connection he sought in his own prayers, just using different words. This didn't make him some enlightened philosopher. He probably still preferred his own culture's food, found his own religion most comforting, felt most at home speaking his native language, but he'd learned to set those preferences aside when business required it. He could eat unfamiliar food without complaining, could observe foreign religious festivals with respect, could negotiate in languages where he understood more about tone and gesture than actual words. Adaptation wasn't optional for merchants, it was the core skill. Think about what that means for a moment. The merchants who thrived on the Silk Road were the ones who could be flexible, who could learn new customs quickly, who could find ways to bridge between radically different worldviews without betraying their own values. The rigid ones failed. The merchants who insisted on doing everything the way we do it back home found themselves cheated, lost, or worse. The ones who couldn't adapt to local customs offended potential trading partners. The ones who refused to learn new techniques for preserving food or treating animals or reading weather patterns died of entirely preventable causes in unfamiliar territories. Meanwhile, the adapters survived. They learned, they synthesized, they took the best ideas from every culture they encountered and incorporated them into their practice, and in doing so they became something new, not quite belonging fully to any one culture, but connected to many. They were the human bridges, the living links in a chain that stretched across continents. There's a genetic legacy to this that modern DNA analysis has revealed. In the cities along the Silk Road, populations mixed in unprecedented ways. A merchant from Persia might marry a local woman in a Central Asian trading town. Their children might marry Chinese traders passing through. After centuries of this, the genetic diversity in major trading centers became extraordinary. Nearly 10% of the modern global gene pool carries evidence of these Silk Road-era migrations and mixings. But the deeper legacy isn't genetic, it's psychological, cultural, spiritual even. The merchants proved that humans can cooperate across enormous differences. That trust can be built with people who pray to different gods and speak incomprehensible languages. That mutual benefit's possible even when power's unequal and understandings incomplete. They proved it not through preaching or conquest, but through the simple daily practice of honest commerce. Consider the merchant's ledger again, that boring catalogue of prices and distances and weather conditions. Each entry represents a choice: to trust or not trust, to help or exploit, to build a relationship or grab a quick profit. Multiply those choices by millions of merchants over hundreds of years, and you get the Silk Road, not as a thing that was built, but as a pattern that emerged from countless individual decisions to cooperate rather than cheat, to connect rather than isolate. This is what empires forgot, that the most enduring structures aren't made of stone or enforced by swords. They're made of habits, of repeated interactions, of networks of mutual obligation, built up transaction by transaction, conversation by conversation, kindness by kindness. A Roman emperor could command an army to march from Britain to Mesopotamia, and they'd do it for as long as the emperor lived and the empire had the resources to pay them. But a merchant network built on trust and mutual profit could survive the fall of Rome, could survive the fragmentation of China, could survive the Mongol conquests and the spread of the Black Death, and the rise and fall of a dozen different religions, because it wasn't held together by force. It was held together by need, and by the understanding that meeting that need required cooperation. The deep wisdom here is about how change actually happens in human societies. We tend to think of history as a story of great leaders making bold decisions. Alexander decides to conquer Persia. Muhammad receives divine revelation. Genghis Khan unites the Mongol tribes, and those moments matter, certainly. They shape the flow of events, but beneath them, slower and steadier, runs the current of ordinary people making ordinary choices. The merchant who decides to extend credit to a stranger who seems trustworthy, the innkeeper who warns travelers about bandits ahead instead of simply taking their money and letting them ride into danger, the guide who goes the extra mile, literally, to show visitors the safest path. These small kindnesses compound. They create expectations, they establish norms. Over time, they become culture, and culture outlasts conquest. Think about what the Silk Road transmitted. Yes, there were goods, silk and spices and precious metals, but the things that mattered most were intangible. Technologies, certainly. Paper and printing and gunpowder changed the world. Mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, medical techniques, agricultural innovations, all of these spread along trade routes carried by merchants who might not have fully understood them but recognized their value. But more than technology, the Silk Road spread stories, ideas about how to live, different ways of organizing society, alternative approaches to art and music and architecture, new recipes, new games, new ways of thinking about time and space and the divine. A merchant carrying a bale of silk might also be carrying a story he heard 3 cities back about a miracle-working prophet, or a new way of arranging numbers that made calculations easier, or a recipe for a medicine that cured fevers, or simply a joke that made him laugh, translated across 3 languages, ready to be shared at the next caravanserai. These informal exchanges were how cultures actually influenced each other, not through formal diplomatic missions or military conquest, but through casual conversation between people who'd found ways to communicate despite language barriers. The merchant's real cargo was connection itself, and connection, it turns out, is what humans need most. Not just physically, though trade in food and medicine and tools certainly kept people alive, but psychologically, spiritually, we need to know we're not alone, that our struggles are shared by others, even others who seem vastly different from us, that the human experience is fundamentally universal even when its expressions are infinitely varied. The Silk Road taught this lesson to everyone it touched. The Chinese scholar reading a text originally written in Sanskrit, translated into Persian, now rendered into Chinese, was learning that wisdom could come from anywhere. The Central Asian musician, incorporating melodies from both East and West, was discovering that beauty transcends borders. The Persian astronomer, using instruments designed in China to calculate movements of planets known to Greek philosophers, was participating in a truly universal quest for knowledge. None of this required anyone to abandon their own identity. The Chinese scholar remained Chinese, the musician remained Central Asian, the astronomer remained Persian, but they all became something more, participants in a larger human project. This is the deepest knowledge the merchants carried, that you can be yourself while also being part of something bigger. That local identity and global connection aren't opposites but complements, that the more deeply you understand your own culture, the better equipped you are to appreciate others. The failed merchants were usually the ones who couldn't hold this balance. Either they clung too rigidly to their own ways and couldn't adapt, or they tried to become whoever their current trading partners wanted them to be and lost themselves in the process. The successful ones maintained their core identity while remaining open to influence. They knew who they were, which allowed them to encounter otherness without feeling threatened by it. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you recognize yourself in this description. In your own life, you navigate between different contexts constantly. You're one person at work, another with family, another with close friends. You adapt your language, your behavior, your presentation to fit different situations, but beneath all that adaptation, there's a core you, a set of values and memories and relationships that define who you are, regardless of context. The Silk Road merchants were doing this same thing, just on a larger scale, adapting constantly while maintaining their essential selves. And in the process, they built bridges between worlds. You're doing this too, you know. Every time you try to understand someone different from yourself, you're building a bridge. Every time you adapt to a new situation while maintaining your integrity, you're practicing the merchant's wisdom. Every time you extend trust to someone you don't know well, you're creating the possibility of connection. The Silk Road isn't just history. It's a pattern that repeats whenever humans choose connection over isolation, cooperation over competition, trust over fear. You can see it today in the way cities work. Millions of strangers coordinating their activities through systems of mutual benefit so complex that no one person understands all of it. You can see it in the way ideas spread through modern networks faster than ever, but following ancient patterns of person-to-person transmission and adaptation. You can see it in your own life, in the web of relationships that sustain you, the small kindnesses you exchange with neighbors, the professional networks built on mutual respect and shared benefit, the friendships that bridge different backgrounds and perspectives. You're a merchant too, in a sense. Not of goods, perhaps, but of time and attention and care. And the choices you make about who to trust, how to cooperate, when to adapt and when to stand firm. These choices compound just as merchant choices did, creating the culture you live in. The desert nights fully settled now. Our imaginary merchants drifted off to sleep, lulled by the familiar sounds of the caravan at rest. Tomorrow he'll wake before dawn, check his animals, calculate his next day's journey. He'll make 100 small decisions, each one seemingly insignificant. But those decisions, multiplied across millions of merchants over centuries, reshape the world. Your decisions, multiplied across billions of people today, are reshaping it still. The deep knowledge the merchants carried wasn't complex, it was almost embarrassingly simple. Treat people fairly, build relationships, adapt when necessary, trust carefully but genuinely, deliver what you promise, help others succeed so you can succeed together. Empires fell because they forgot these simple truths. They thought power and control were what mattered. They spent their energy on conquest and tribute, on forcing compliance and demanding submission, but the merchants remembered, and their way of being in the world, flexible, adaptive, focused on mutual benefit, survived everything empires could throw at it. It survives still, in you, in the choices you make about how to be in relationship with others, in the small daily practices of honesty and fair dealing and genuine curiosity about people different from yourself. The Silk Road was never really about silk. It was about the human capacity for connection, about our ability to find common ground despite vast differences. about the way small acts of trust and kindness compound into civilizations. That capacity lives in you, those same human desires that drove merchants across deserts and mountains, the desire for beauty, for knowledge, for connection, for something better than what you have now. Those desires are what make you human too, and as the desert night settles around the sleeping caravan with camels breathing softly and merchants dreaming of home, you realize you're part of this story too, connected to those merchants across centuries through the endless chain of commerce and care. And sleep comes as gently as a merchant's hand, settling the reins of his final beast for the night.